Hello everyone, today we once again comment on scholagladiatoria's work, more specifically on its more recent upload, Why Did Pike Blocks Make a Comeback in the Renaissance? You're probably thinking, oh Schwerpunkt, you have nothing better to do than criticizing other people's works. As you know, and I always repeat it at the beginning of each such video. First of all, this is a matter of election. Scholagladiatoria talks about interesting things, there is nothing to do about it. It's actually also a solid video. There are some things that I disagree with, as we will see now, but otherwise, great respect. Again, I always say this in particular to Matt Easton for his work. And of course, like most of it is correct. The only things that here struck me, because I normally don't even watch any other channel, and whenever I see a title that I can't understand is mostly going to touch upon topics that we somehow are pretty involved in, I will listen and to it, and there's always going to be something worth commenting, especially this is a slightly longer video, half an hour, right? Except the last part is so correct that I don't need really to comment on it. The later modern development from pike and shot to essentially linear warfare is fundamentally correct. I'm not going to comment on it. We'll stop, in fact, at some point. The earlier part of this is something that sort of made me think, wait a minute, let's get things a bit sort of straighter here. First of all, the premise is very interesting. Why did pike blocks make a comeback in the Renaissance, implying naturally that they had existed in antiquity, and therefore you would expect a comparison, or why did they exist in antiquity to begin with? And at the end of the day, he sort of indirectly responds to that, but the video is not quite about that. Perfectly fine. He talks mostly about late medieval warfare, predictably, and part of the early modern one as well. And that's exactly where, as we will see now, we can add something, sort of adjusting perhaps certain views or bias, whatever. Now, I will read as usual from the script. Like, the pike was a very long spear, and it was a weapon that dominated warfare in Europe for about a century and a half. It is fair to say that. You could say 2 centuries if you count exactly the moment in which the Swiss basically introduced it, but was not already generalized. So maybe, yes, a century and a half, etc., as Easton says, from the late medieval period and right the way through the Renaissance. And he says, of course, being a simple weapon, really being a long spear, inherently the pike wasn't a new weapon. Of course, it had been famously used by people like Alexander the Great, Macedonians, incredibly important in ancient warfare. And really, you could say that the Romans kind of spelled the end of the age of the pike in classical war. But the question here is, why did the pike make such a massive comeback in the late medieval period in the Renaissance? And why did it disappear again? So here, he repeats the question, and he says, I think most people realize or think that the pike is something sort of particularly of the 17th century and the so-called pike and shot era. Well, I would say most of the 16th century, just by impression, if you ask me. He says, we'll come back to that expression, what it actually means, in a second. But in fact, they first started making a resurgence, bearing in mind that, of course, they've been very prominent in the ancient world. They first started making resurgence actually in the 15th century. It's even more complicated than that, yes. So why did the pike make such a big comeback when it did, and why did it disappear again afterward? There is this sponsor, and so he says, so the first very obvious reason to the question why the pike became so popular in the 16th century and the end of the 15th century as well, in fact, is, I'm sure lots of you are instantly shouting this at the screen, gunpowder. And personally, as Schwerpunkt, when I listened to this, I said, what? Why? It doesn't seem to have been that. There isn't much of a connection per se between the sort of strengthening of pike forces and the introduction of gunpowder per se, if not indirectly, and with, say, connected with other arms. At that point, it was mostly like the reason why pikes strengthened that much was cavalry, right? And gunpowder, again, as we'll see now, because it's always the same bias. If you look at all the videos that I made about scholagladiatoria, all, like, any sort of distortion boils down to this bias in favor, this overrating of missile warfare at some point. And here we have a jump, because naturally traditional sort of missile warfare was not as performing as gunpowder one, right? So you can't say that Easton even just doesn't know certain sort of aspects, doesn't have a sophisticated understanding of the art of war. For some reason, he wants to sort of put missile warfare at the center of everything. In the last video, last week, he literally said it. Maybe the bow was even more important than the spear, even in a context of medieval warfare. And again, made lots of other videos in this context that we can't talk about that again, but I think we exhausted the topic. Let's see how this, I would like to treat this as an example of how a serious person involved in sort of historical martial arts, but also more because he's knowledgeable about warfare of the period in general, can sort of eschew like the sort of the entire system and its sort of general criticism and analysis for one factor that is sort of enlarged to a dimension that really wasn't there, because otherwise the rest makes sense. So I got very curious when I read that, and it says, now in fact gunpowder had been around in warfare since the 13th century, certainly by the 14th century. We find references to guns being present, for example, at the Crécy, but also prominently during the siege of Harfleur in 1415, and obviously used in the 100 Years' War as well. Guns of various sorts, large artillery pieces, and handheld guns known as handguns, not to be confused with Glocks, or whatever. This made me laugh then. But handheld guns were already something which were increasingly being used, particularly in certain areas, although generally speaking all over Europe in the 15th century. And of course, these new fangled firearms had some disadvantages, particularly the early ones. This isn't a firearms video per se, but it's important to note, number one, they were slow to reload, and the people operating firearms were particularly vulnerable while they were doing it. And so, just like archers and crossbowmen, they were particularly vulnerable to infantry, close-to-hand combat troops, and of course, especially to cavalry. So, let's reflect on what he's saying. So, you already understand where he's going with that. He's basically trying to depict the development of pike warfare in the Renaissance, mostly as some necessity, some essentially auxiliary role, we could think, to prevent other heavy infantry, or whomever, cavalry as well, to attack the missile element. Now, and this is the first contradiction of the entire mechanism, meaning that if you claim that, it means that evidently, if these guys had to be protected, they weren't determinant, and as a consequence, they weren't decisive, and thus, as always, and again, we repeated this over and over again, commenting on scholagladiatoria videos, missile warfare, right, and well until throughout gunpowder era up to, as we will see now, essentially the mid-17th century, and regardless also of numerical proportion, because one thing is the troops, one thing is the actual power we can deliver, two very different things, was not decisive, all right? Pikemen were heavy infantry, which means that by definition, these other guys out there, Easton was talking about even archers in the last video, saying we must reevaluate them because they also were armed with melee weapons. Okay, they were light. All right, it means that against heavy infantry, they could not hold the ground. And that means that if, in this sense, the missile element had been more important, this could not have happened, because at that point, they were superior, or these guys, between the various volleys, would have just stood there doing what, like taking hits, or for not? Obviously not. Like you can, and right off the bat, this is the greater problem in this video, is that you can absolutely and straightforwardly say that essentially pike warfare remained on the battlefields as long as pikes were decisive. All right, there were pikemen sometimes also in the later period, because of course battles are not some absolute equation. You can find even during Napoleonic Wars there are some sort of scratch emergential levies that were armed with pikes in different, I don't know, also close contexts like garrisons, whatever. This is not important. We're talking about quote-unquote conventional warfare in open field, right? That as long as the pikemen could advance, right, and aggressively so, they could obliterate who was in the front unless there were other pikemen. And they were going for it in any case, because battles revolved around pikemen beating the hell out of one another, right? And so the role even of arquebusiers and even musketeers for a while was actually subordinated to pike warfare, right? And this is what you can immediately use as a, okay, no, like the reason why pike warfare developed so much at that point was not to wait, to stand there waiting your arquebusiers to reload, and battles being won by arquebusiers shooting at one another, or handgunners of other kind, as he's coming from the later medieval perspective. All right, it was about, as historically at this point, the bigger change was actually the fact that pikemen were able to crush cavalry. That had a massive collapse, and I think it's the more important factor here, the most important arm in that regard. It did not disappear from battlefields. It was actually still, as we'll see now, importantly used, including, as it had always historically done, to actually charge into pike squares, even during the Renaissance, which is what they would have not done sort of immediately, but as we've seen in multiple battles of the 16th century, of course, that's what cavalry does. Cavalry does only one thing, right? And the gendarmes weren't designed to charge into arquebusiers. They were designed to charge into heavies, whether cavalry or infantry, right? So this is the big spoiler, big premise. There is already, you understand, conceptually, right? This is the first concept that he uses to go at for the answer, right? And this already, even though he doesn't actually say, as we'll see now, terrible things, I think that's important to bear in mind. And I would like really, again, I don't presume that Easton watches my videos, whatever. That's not the point. But if he ever was like, if somebody wants to tell him whatever, that there is an important sort of overestimation of missile warfare in his strategic analysis. All right, it's very important, and I think that he would be one of the best sort of disclosures of the medieval or early modern art war if he really got this right. He already is, right, in his own field, mostly from an EMA perspective, but he can absolutely step up to something even better, right, in a broader range. Then he continues writing, now cavalry were one of the standard responses to massed archers. This is also, if I had forgotten he stated this. Now, cavalry were one of the standard responses to massed archers? No, right? This was not actually the point. It says, because here I actually filtered the script, let's say, it says, we say this in the 100 Years' War, they specifically tried to use cavalry to counter archers because of course, the infantry can only advance fairly and slow. So, no, it says if you can't quickly get cavalry into the archer formation, you can obviously kill some of them. So here again, I had how did I miss this today? I don't remember. This is much like worse than I remembered. I even made years ago a video against diversity. There's nothing to do about it. The Anglosphere, British, Australians, etc., are overly fixated with a massive longbow bias, right? Just because at Azincourt, at some point, the French are claimed by one source that they would try to attack the English archers, or flanks in any case, which they were probably not just archers, or these archers were also capable of holding the ground if they weren't the only ones, as in particular they did, as those wings. And so basically a great deal, we've seen it in the other videos, of the entire sort of conventional warfare paradigm in late medieval Europe for Eastern revolves around, cavalry was normally used to basically knock out archers. That wasn't the case. All right, charges against archers were not carried out, if not in conditions of exuberance. In fact, in the case of the French at Azincourt, also because those cavalry wings were really the expression of a numerical superiority and overconfidence, for which these wings were actually pretty badly composed by the French, and that's also why they actually failed against those wings. But it's so exceptional, right? And overall, considering that the battle was decided, as always, in the center between heavies, and after actually a protracted clash, right, that the archers could not sustain it to hand-to-hand combat anyway, it cannot be said. But in I don't know any other battle in which basically, even assuming that we get Azincourt right, because don't think that through sort of the accounts available, we actually know what were the actual quantities involved in that combat, right? But the notion that cavalry would have been squandered against archers is completely anti-historical, and it does not find any evidence anywhere. Right? If you can find in this smaller context, of course, at some point strange things happening, but they're secondary contexts. They have nothing to do with how battle lines normally engage one another. And if the fact that the French could wipe the floor of English archers intentionally, ideally at least, in the case of Azincourt, is also pretty exceptional, and it confirms actually the rule where the whomever would actually charge in the center. Even had they been French against French, French versus English, or English versus English for that matter, right? So no, the cavalry, especially as an arm, was definitely not, and never was actually, one of the standard responses to massed archers, all right? Unless we're talking, again, for mop-in operations with lighter cavalry that was normally, in fact, they're often charging even when just chasing light infantry in open ground in loose order, as the enemy was already broken, and in any case, the missile is itself in loose order, deployed normally. You don't find heavy cavalry conventionally attacking missile troops just to crush them, to eventually have a reason of the battle. These battles odds were much more balanced than we think, and that's why conventionally battle lines had fought against one another with heavies in the center, whether in attack and defense, whether cavalry and infantry. This little game is mostly happening in later Middle Ages, in the 100 Years' War, which type it's still the heavies with the lights on the wings, right? Which also means that symmetrically, spectrally, the wings of the lights fought against each other, just like the heavies in the center fought against each other. And the standard practice was to destroy the enemy wings and then closing on the flanks of the enemy. Of course, if at Azincourt the French had so many troops more than the English conventionally, which has also been, as you know, historiographically a bit much reduced, and we find that specific instance of, at some point also in the battle, and there is the notion that they couldn't outflank them because there was a forest in flank. Yeah, there is definitely in that specific battle a trail of sources speaking of this, and we will see and how much this actually holds scrutiny considering the other sources for that matter when we will make the video about through the primary sources about the Battle of Agincourt. But there would have obviously been cavalrymen at some point going against those wings at some point, but not the full block, like the bulk of the heavies being squandered against the wings. It would have disordered them, which meant that would have spent them in a way, it would have put them in an odd position compared to the enemy forces that, yes, as they had been outflanked here, ideally could also outflank them or pair them in the same way, performing those maneuvers. And the best way instead to use them was to launch them frontally against the enemy. And again, if you have an idea of, generally speaking, the medieval art of war, you don't find much evidence of cavalry having ever been a response, especially a standard response to massed archers. Also because massed archers somehow always kind of existed on the wings by some degree. And so there's nothing really unusual even about what was happening in the English armies of the 100 Years' War, as we also talked last spring a lot. So this is... he goes on and says, you can disperse them to, so he's talking about missile with cavalry, but also you can interrupt their shooting while your infantry advances. Again, nobody used to do this, right? It's not much of a picture. If you have heavies, you can always make them dismount for that matter, engaging in the center. That's conventionally the best and virtually only way you can use. There are exceptions to, however, a standard practice, which was the only standard practice here. Definitely cavalry was not a standard response to mass archers in medieval war. He says, now it's very obvious to anyone, I should think that, so, and consider that what he's doing here, he just previously said that basically arquebusiers took a while to reload, and if, you know, longbows were effective, imagine like at that point, like the sheer jowls unleashed by an arquebus, and yes, it was lower to reload. Actually, the same Eastern touches on the topic later, but his idea is basically that pikemen, here at least one factor is, because he adds others, and in others is also definitely more correct, would have been a response to, okay, to protect the missile. No, all right? In Renaissance warfare, pike blocks were assisted by missiles, all right? They were the decisive element, and the shot served to support the heavies, not to win battles for them, all right? More of that later, because he really goes a fairly long way in saying that most of the kills were actually inflicted by the shot, which is definitely not the case in Renaissance warfare. Then he says, now it's very obvious to anyone, I should think, that a really long stick with a spiky bit on the end is a good way of countering cavalry, but it's also useful against other infantry. So in other words, pikemen were particularly well suited to defending people operating firearms. No, right? We don't have an actual evidence of this. If you mean that pike and shot warfare partially functioned like that, it's because the heavies were decisively unpassable unless you threw other heavies against them. And so obviously the shot would sort of hide sometimes behind the pike to be protected by that, but not because the purpose of the battle was the shot to fire and the pike is just simply a subsidiary thing to defend the shot. All right, that's not a thing also because you can't simply just kill people at a distance with those firearms and gain the ground held by the heavies. Then he says, now perhaps the nation most famously associated with the early use of the pike are the Swiss, and of course they used pikes extensively both in their wars against the Holy Roman Empire but also against the Burgundians. I'll come back to that in a second. I would like to add, I don't remember if he says something against that, but obviously this is for Schwerpunkt mostly. We made really lots of videos about both wars. Just recently we talked about the Burgundian Wars and the Swiss Wars against the Habsburgs. And in Swiss military history, while the pike obviously was always there, as we'll see, there it was a much more universal weapon than we think, also throughout the Middle Ages, among others, for the heavies. But there's a radical difference between the 14th and 15th century Swiss army. We repeat it all the time, it's very important. The 14th century Swiss armies were pretty much identical to other infantry armies that for some political and social cocktail were to face feudal knights, like in the given circumstances, right? There was nothing really unique about them. There was a sort of predilection for the vote for that matter, and so again the idea of the halberd, etc. But for the rest, these kind of weapons were also pretty much all over Europe, and they were, as we'll see now, employed together with pikes already by everyone practically. What the Swiss really do from the mid 15th century onwards is to radically increase the amount of pikemen, and as we know, like basically becoming an at that point, cavalry weapon, because cavalry dominated the battlefield. The Swiss didn't have any other arm for given their political and social consistency, and so they went just for that, increasing drastically the collective training of their infantry that was, at that point, for the first time in the Middle Ages, once again engaging upon a cavalry proper, like getting out there in open field on the move against cavalry, which had never been the case. In the 14th century, the Swiss did not engage cavalry, not in ambushes, as that's obviously an asymmetrical context that allows that, like in any other army for that matter. They stood very well on their high ground, very still, very much compact and waiting for cavalry charges, right? So the Swiss really changed a big deal of stuff in the art of war in the Renaissance period, because they're the first to have a solid infantry enough to resort to advancing columns to especially attemptively take the enemy by surprise, which they successfully do during the Burgundian Wars, all right? Other powers had pikemen. Actually, the reason why the Swiss reformed their army with more pikes that require, given their longer, more collective training, not much a great, more sophisticated fencing. Easton says something along that pattern. I don't know, not quite, but almost to make it sound like that. It's not really true. Like there's a much more sophisticated. It's about movement, right? Being able to remain in formation as opposed to actually fighting with a pike. It was all about the mass, the push, whatever. Because they were defeated by Carmagnolas, Milanese, dismounted knights that beat them actually in part also at length of spears, and they decided they couldn't take defeats like the one over Bedo anymore. All right. Then Matthewson says, and we'll come back to that in a second, and they made extensive use of the pike, but also they were early sort of mainstream adopters of handguns. This, honestly, I also strongly disagree, at least in the comparative sense that he's making here, because he says, in other words, arquebuse is an early form of musket. So aside from the fact that, okay, depends on what you called musket, because these are also weapons that are lost in the proto or mostly undocumentable history, fog sort of history. Musket initially was a movable artillery, right? It eventually developed into a handgun, etc. But the Swiss actually were not particularly notorious for a great deal of missile capacity at all. All right. If you look at other European armies, actually the Swiss severely lagged behind in any kind of technology. They were just like the sheer, push of thickly packed columns of mountaineers, mostly involved in hand-to-hand combat. They had screens of skirmishers like every other army out there, but definitely they weren't, he says, he didn't say that they were the top, etc. But again, they properly weren't among the first, nor they were actually among the last. Right? They had mostly to get also their cannons from the Burgundians because they didn't have properly the resources for that. It may seem strange because of how overly wealthy the Swiss are today, but at the time, that's actually improperly the point. So we're told, and we've seen again, also in videos recently about the Burgundian wars, that they did screen, they did give time to their columns to maneuver by engaging the enemy with skirmishes and so on. But this was also pretty standard practice, was normal. We don't have evidence of any sort of particularly consistent element of shooters or other missile troops in Swiss armies at this period compared to the Burgundians that had much greater missile power, to the Italians in the south, from which also the Swiss had actually drawn historically a great deal. We were talking about Arbedo before, but they were fighting in Italian armies also since the 14th century themselves. That surely helped a bit there in their exploit against the Habsburgs. So we're looking at military cultures that are actually at their peak of probably medieval civilization and warfare, that are drastically more advanced at practically anything that the Swiss have, except their homogeneously, in this sense, mass-trained infantry by tactical standards, right? And I stress this in anticipation of what is insane, because he's going to basically make the point that the Swiss were sort of the creators in some protoform of pike and shot warfare, which is actually not correct, right? I also made a video about Gonzalo de Cordoba. The Spanish are the actual creators of pike and shot warfare in any meaningful sense. The Swiss did not have such a thing like a distinguished arm of shooters that executed a combined arm tactics in a way that made both that would make otherwise both arms irrelevant. All right, this is something that develops, as also Easton comes to touch on later, with the battles of the Battle of Cerignola in particular. But he sort of attributes to the Swiss some kind of foreground in the previous development. And again, I have been covering Swiss military history of that period from a long time, never really encountered any indicator whatsoever that the Swiss had any particular proclivity for guns early in the day, without mentioning that, again, there were other armies that actually had lots of pikemen, although not in the sort of column square, especially the column, because the Swiss initially didn't quite create a square, much of a column rather. Like the square develops a bit, if you want to conceptualize the term geometrically speaking, a bit later when those formations became like massive bases of pikemen surrounded also by other troops, including the cavalry and missile that could not dislodge those pikemen from the field, and that made them in some cases more stationary, and only after this traditional warfare more capable of smashing through the enfeebled enemy formations, but also going into hand-to-hand combat very sort of straightforwardly otherwise. The Swiss had not arrived to that, right? They mostly integrated their columns in other fully developed armies, as we will see now, the French. So again, no, and Easton says, so if we look at the Swiss art of the late 15th century, late 1400s, we see specifically their forces are often made up of people either with pikes or crossbows and guns mixed together. Yes, right, he shows also a famous illumination from the era. There are essentially bunches of Swiss with handguns and other pikemen close to them. But aside from the fact that illuminations hardly ever provide us, that at that point they start sort of representing larger bodies of men, in combat, but they're not really the sort of the photography of what would have actually happened on a battlefield, also in terms of proportions. They would have had handgunners, right? Because all your Western Europeans used handguns at that point. They would have had pikemen, but again, there is no way to claim that the Swiss had any greater type of proclivity towards the missile element, right? This is something actually I've seen being done by some scholarship here and there, but not really without any. Actually, it's attempted, just like, or sort of thrown in anecdotally, as just looking at illuminations like those and saying, oh, look, there were also the gunners. Well, which other place didn't have guns, right? If you look at the most advanced sort of artillery technology, or at least handgun technology in particular, at this point was from Italy. Italy had already from the last decades of the 14th century a third of their infantry composed of gunners, handgunners, right? This is also what Mallet, studied, whatever. So there were definitely nations, including, you can argue, if you look at the English at this point, together with their longbows, at this point, they had a much greater missile capacity easily than the Swiss. The Swiss, again, in particular, do not seem to have had any larger sort of mass combined armed tactics with missile, like the English had, for example. And also in their ways, like the French had, the Burgundians had, the Italians had it. So, again, this is not, in my opinion, like the right foot to start from in sort of introducing the Swiss by claiming that there is this kind of, because it says literally here, they're kind of the Swiss, of early adopters and the sort of the prototype, as it were, of the pike and shot ethos. No, right? The Swiss ethos was one of the most radically and primitively brutal hand-to-hand combat pike column one, right? The gun, they didn't even care about what it was. The Swiss society at the time didn't have much of a third estate to affluently produce large amounts of new technologies to render it available on the field. And in fact, actually, we will see it now if you look at the history of the Italian wars, where the Swiss military is eclipsed after also a very sort of relatively short arc, right, of a couple of generations. And after that, you don't really hear of the Swiss much in the history of warfare anymore. You realize that the reason why they were beaten is the fact that they were just pikemen, and that they encounter enemies that played combined armed tactics, and they were done for, per se, right? They were also a bit unlucky. Actually, they were lucky to lose during the Italian wars, because eventually Switzerland would be able to transform itself with what is today, but very much indirectly with hindsight. Again, and I stress it, the Swiss were not particularly pioneering any kind of pike and shot tactics during the period they were beating the Burgundians. All right, if they had gunners and they used them in pretty conventional ways as auxiliary forces, and not as a fully fledged army in any meaningfully quantitative way. All right, they had that. Again, I can't stress enough, but there is a difference between what that is, like some skirmishers peppering the enemy lines here and there, and a properly combined tactics carried out by two distinct, fully fledged arms that synergically interact with one another to achieve that decisive edge together, like we will see with the Spanish at the Battle of Cerignola. All right, that's a completely different thing, and it's also, again, truly what you see is Swiss fighting, like even in this manuscript, there isn't a line of arquebusiers behind them that is sheltered by the pikes in a sort of more or less static way, inflicting casualties on the enemy. No, right? The Swiss achieved their glorious victories against the Burgundians mostly by sending their columns in a sort of suicidal fashion in, let's say, either we win or we get annihilated, because if you go out there and you're caught in the combined arms of enemy infantry or cavalry, you're done for, right? So instead, they were so good at what they did, because nobody expected infantry to advance so steadily, to advance to begin with, at that point in the art of war, that they managed to catch the enemy by surprise and to fundamentally take him out piecemeal. And by the way, not even always so easily. Like, these were very hardly fought battles, and in any case, the Swiss do not win because of their pike and shot warfare, because of their pike warfare. All right, and quite, again, luckily, because you can't even have a proper victory without luck, but in their case, clamorously so. All right, there are also moral forces. Let's not even give too much importance to weapons or even arms per se. All right, because those must exist when things become conventional, but the edge is moral in nature. In fact, actually, Easton knows the story. He says, and a key moment was the Battle of Seminars in 1495, where a combined French army with heavy cavalry and Swiss pikemen conclusively defeated the Spanish, which is also, in fact, as we've seen in the video about El Gran Capitan, the thing that triggers fundamentally the later sort of Spanish reforms, or at least adaptation in the same southern Italy, but in the Spanish army to that kind of threat, right? And Easton says now, in fact, the Spanish, to their credit, quickly turned this around and adopted pike and shot strategy for themselves as well into essentially what's a combined arms formation. And the Spanish increased their proportion of pikes to 50% and then conclusively defeated the French and Swiss at the Battle of Cerignola in southern Italy, essentially in 1503. And so what actually happened is that the French were using, first of all, Swiss infantry because they didn't really have a strong native infantry of their own, because the French nobility did not want to arm the masses, right, of France, because, revolution is always behind the corner. They were actually right about that. They probably lost the Italian wars like that. But what happens here is not any particular proclivity of either, even of the French and the Swiss combined, in fact, to have any strong shot, right? The only strong shot the French had, admittedly, was artillery, which was the best of the era there. Again, the French had everything strong. The cavalry was strong, artillery strong, except infantry. So they integrate the Swiss that have the strongest infantry, and you can simply go with that, right? The Spanish are defeated, but what the Spanish achieve at Cerignola is actually the Swiss already had that very high proportion of pikes by themselves. Here, the Spanish weren't even basically consciously wanting to reach that, all right? They wanted to combine their pikes with their shot, plus other, we'll see now later, the rodaleros that also Easton mentions, that were some relics still of essentially a medieval kind of warfare. So actually you find some anachronisms of success, just like, the Polish hussars back further ahead in time, like that come from specific traditions. In the case of the Spanish, it was a vast individual militarization of the hidalgos during their conquista, and just even a normal type of sort of swordmen that still existed actually in armies, included even the Swiss would have had that. Just you don't see that because, again, as you don't see mostly gunners other than what were used, it was used normally in European armies at the time. All right, so this narrative sounds very much like the Swiss invented pike and shot warfare, and then the Spanish, to their credit, adapted from it, and they sort of took it from right? The Spanish completely created a new type of art of war, which is also the actual one that spreads, and in fact wipes sort of the Swiss out of the equation, right? International standing, right? All armies, in fact, here the same Easton says that this is a period of rapid adoption of the pike all around Europe, so much that we see the army of Florence in 1506 has a whooping 70% of its army made of pikemen. That didn't, by the way, change much because the Florentines were notoriously bad at war. They didn't commit themselves, and there's made some videos about, not Machiavelli, at least with Ciardini explaining what was going on there. Also recently made a video about Giovanni de' Medici. And they didn't have enough pikemen to at least withstand, for example, the German Landsknecht. And I also recently made a video. In fact, Easton says, indeed, in the early 1500s, we see that the German Landsknechts, he says, have as many as 70% or even 75% of pikes in their armies also. Yes, and this is not much the fact that they had, you see, already at the time, the problem of pike and the quality of pike and shot is actually having a robust amount of pikemen and a robust amount of shot combined, right? So having so many pikes per se wasn't actually the point. I know that the video here obviously is probably going back on the tracks of why were so many pikemen, but in this sense, the Landsknecht, they actually were copying the Swiss a little bit, competing with them. Germany was actually a very advanced, technologically advanced country, but did not, as we'll see now later, have necessarily the capacity to, the statal power concentration to simply introduce a greater deal of firepower. Right? So the Landsknecht as well as the Swiss are actually, as Central Europeans, a bit more primitive than, say, for example, the Italians that we just look at here technologically wise. Truly, actually, the most technologically advanced country was Italy at the time, but this obviously didn't save them from what happened during the Italian wars. Remember that. So actually, the Swiss were still the ones that had all those, that numerous amount of pikemen, and still they eclipsed themselves from the international scene, because at the end of the day, they can't compete now with princely and actually monarchic stattal armies like, again, the Spanish, the French, the French that use them as well, and the Germans. That and occasionally also other provincial foes that would actually beat them, because the Swiss weren't much else but infantry in the form of pikemen and not much of shooters at all in a combined fashion. So I just recently even made a video about the actual impact of the Swiss art of war, in which we talk about how you can say overrated they are, because in my opinion the Swiss are actually underrated, but not in the way that people normally think they were. And so in fact they were some kind of offshoot of Central European mountaineer sturdiness that managed to create like a very conceptually new type of infantry training, and model was copied by others, but it ended there, right? Probably things were just already developing the fare of the pike, even hadn't there been the Swiss, it would have happened, because there were already lots of pikemen actually in all other European armies, and this is what this video of scholagladiatoria sort of doesn't necessarily sort of emphasize more than much, or reduces just to a bunch of, I don't know, the Scots, the Flemish. Actually, pikemen existed also among the French, the Spanish, the Italian army. They were completely normally there, all right? So to make the long story short, he comes back more or less on track from the Swiss divergence. So he says, so thanks to the rapid adoption of firearms all over Europe in the late 1400s, end of the 1400s, and the very beginning of the 1500s, so essentially around the year 1500, bear that I'm simply reading from the script of the video. It was just improvised. It wasn't scripted, so he's talking and conceptualizing well. I mean, Easton is, again, he sticks to step-by-step connections. He has his plot, and it's interesting to follow it, right? So I also give it this, that I have the possibility now and of simply criticize on something that I've already watched in the video that I'm rereading now, comfortably sitting, and it's different from just being in front of a camera as he does, with very few cuts and simply saying what he thinks. So I'm not, again, assaulting, aggressing him. I can't reiterate how positively I think of his work in general, considering also the general standards of YouTube, right? It doesn't take much to, I say it for myself, to elevate ourselves from the average standard of YouTube, but at least, hey, there is somebody who does that. It's very important, because there is substance into it, right? Form, maybe, but form, I'm him talking theoretically, not in the form of the videos. Naturally, his videos are also much better than mine in the graphic form, or whatever you want to say. And so he says, if we see that the pike being adopted pretty much as quickly as handguns were being, all right? So, and this is an interesting point he makes, right? When you listen to the video from the beginning, you say, that's where he wanted to get. So he basically tells you, oh, this stuff happened. It doesn't matter how sort of, here, again, I corrected it along the way, but he powerfully comes back with this and makes you think about it. In between, what happened is that you have pikemen and shooters, right, at the same time. So there must have been a connection, right? Remember what he said at the beginning, that foremost we've talked about pike. But this can actually be explained. We'll explain this further. He will actually do it himself through certain mechanics that are really not technological per se, even though he actually stressed the technological side as well, among others. At least it's mostly a political issue, an institutional one, and whatever. It's a bit the moral temper of the post 14th century crisis, European landscape, and so on, the establishment. But it makes it sound as if pike and guns were to simply go in parallel. Now there is a factor we'll touch upon. I mean, the fact that cavalry was reduced by pikes will, in a sense, obviously favor with the development of the shot. But to be more sort of formally coherent, when you look at the development of the shot, this is actually going in parallel with the simple fact that technology allowed for more powerful weapons to be used on the battlefield. And pikes had always been there, always been existed. So what you see with guns is actually just the traditional weapons being gradually substituted with gunpowder, with firearms technology. And so that's basically that, right? So it will take, if you look at the development, for example, we will see it even in the center of the Middle Ages, large amounts of pikemen. This had actually existed. Nobody really tells you this, but the bigger picture of the Middle Ages should be what was happening in the 13th and early 14th centuries. All right, there you had armies that had single infantry wings composed largely by pikemen that, in that sense, were larger than a single Swiss army of the late 15th century. But nobody tells you about that because, again, technologism has pumped, especially also in a proto-Protestant, in this sense mostly Anglosphere influence concept, all disclosure in books, things like the Hussites, the killing of knights, all this kind of stuff, and the idea of the freeing of the world in the modern age. And none of this actually happened, especially the latter, because there was actually an improvement of the individual person, or because armies like the one of the Hussites were anything particular or special or distinctive or actually even dramatically effective, if not in relative terms to their context, in the history of the art of war. There were other countries that were much more military advanced, but nobody talks about them because it's somehow challenging sometimes, like for different reasons, like of identity of nation, national history, or whatever, that unfortunately pop culture and even the academia still suffers a lot, especially in the age of hyper specialization and sort of tunnel vision that comes from that. The problem is that, say, I am a bit the product of the unlocking instead of the means here at our disposal, of the internationalization of knowledge, of the fact that people that are now writing from different parts of Europe, etc., start to point out that the paradigms that we have sort of popularized are a bit different, right? And we should be a bit more careful when looking at this stuff. But here, again, Easton delivers a punchline that makes sort of its effect. Says, so we can't really say that guns and long sticks go together, he points out. And that's actually not much the point, but I can see overall how he pictures that. It's an interesting way of making the point. There are surely, again, factors that bring to the convergence of these two systems to fully integrate and to dominate the battlefields. There is no doubt. But at the same time, what you see still in these armies is largely the continuous development of heavy infantry throughout the previous millennium and in the sanitary world to begin with, also from the previous ones, accompanied by missile power. And now infantry is so strong that it can actually stop cavalry, but it does because of the pike, not because the any missile would stand any chance, including against heavy infantry. Not cavalry alone on the battlefield, right? So this is extremely important. It's, in my opinion, what I'm saying here is, it's not like what I'm saying is correct and what he's saying is incorrect. It's just like there is a hierarchy, right, of functional interaction between arms that mostly comes from well-established mechanisms that made heavy infantry more important than any kind of missile that actually existed out there. Firearms are ever more performing against cavalry, but it's the pike that stops cavalry, not the shot. And I would like to stress this, that now the same Easton will get to the overarching reason why armies, and it's actually great of him to make that point, that I would expand a little bit in the sense of what we often discuss on the channel regarding the exhaustion of society after the late medieval crisis, and the fact that all this power concentration we will see now in terms of monarchs that are able to provide with the funds finally to train large amounts of troops, unlike at least in much greater fashion, or this is also debatable depending on which powers you look at, especially in this first period. Renaissance armies weren't actually much bigger than the ones of the peak of medieval civilization, is also, but let's say in a more directly unitary way, right? Because the system had somehow collapsed, exhausted itself in many ways, and what we call the Ancien Regime had concentrated power, also and especially for the sake of security, of defense of their population. So when you look at this infantry, it's not free people, it's actually salaried soldiers from the fourth estate that are paid by a state that actually rules over them, regardless of how mutinous they could be, if we've seen it for the Landsknecht, etc. We made really lots of videos about early modern warfare. You can check out the playlist, right? I have also one about pike and shot warfare in particular, right? So Easton goes on and says, but that being said, the pike itself, as mentioned, was not a new weapon. Obviously, it had been around in classical times long before firearms made an appearance, but it wasn't even the first appearance or reappearance of the pike in the Middle Ages. And yes, I perfectly agree with that. I'm personally very involved, I would say, in my publishing, in the assessment of that kind of infantry power that was inherently actually pikes. Except Easton here makes the example of Room. And I understand him. De Vries wrote a PhD thesis on this, etc. It's the focus on infantry-only victories. There's a bunch of people in the Middle Ages, you could say actually the Middle Ages, because these victories disappeared after the mid-14th century. Until you have to wait for the Renaissance to have those kind of infantry-only victories. We are in the first half of the 14th century. It's basically the Scots, the Flemish, the Ditmarscher, the Swiss. These peoples lived in a decentralized position amidst bigger powers that were often poorer, except the Flemish, that however did not have really a settled development, like for example the Italian cities. In that, for this reason, fought orphaned for different mechanics, for example in Scotland, because they were literally too poor, of a fully fledged cavalry arm. So at that point in history, no system, no community that could field both cavalry and infantry was so dumb but to go at war just with infantry. All right, these peoples gained their victories mostly because of their moral force, because they were actually desperate, and they were to fight with the only thing they had, right? If you're a Flemish commune, you don't have knights fighting for you, or you don't have at least a strong establishment capable of providing signing with you with lots of cavalry, right? So they actually are led by knights, but these dismount and fight alongside them, right? There are very few, and they're not cavalry anyway. So Easton says so I wouldn't say it's not that they aren't relevant, but that aforementioned sensationalistic, positivistic, technologistic, whatever historiography hyperpumped these victories because they were saying, oh, look, this actually, it's the beginning of the progressive increase in infantry importance. No, like by the mid-14th century, they get so much kicked in the teeth, right? The only ones that don't actually are the Swiss, but also because they are a bit more isolated, they also pick better ground. The Habsburgs are not this terrible enemy, at least for them they were, but in general, like they had also other things to think about than Switzerland. And in general, cavalry dominates well until the later Swiss, like the Burgundian Wars. So we're at the end of the 15th century. So as we'll see now, the point is there were actually much more developed and large and powerful infantries all over Europe than these ones, fighting only with infantry, but for some reason historiography decided to ignore those deliberately. Because, look, it's infantry, if you use this weapon you can defeat cavalry. It's a lot of BS. And also, as we'll explain now, because infantry was composed in Europe in the same identical way. All right, so again, it's even if you want, as of course, like these victories were important and a strain, like they weren't really a small thing overall in the medieval art of war, but it's mostly like moral force, because their infantry was actually just of the same quality, not even inferior than other places, right? So never make the childish mistake of thinking that weapons win wars, because it's one of the single most debunked nonsense in any strategic analysis of art of war history, for that matter. In any case, Easton says, many of you will know about the Battle of the Golden Spurs, in which the Flemish absolutely defeated the cream of French cavalry, heavy cavalry in 1302, and they were predominantly armed with pikes. So this is incorrect. Like, they weren't predominantly armed with pikes. Easton says, yes, they also had good index and various other things, but pikes were a major part of their armaments of this course, and this, of course, was a good way of defeating cavalry. Right, so yes, but this is different from saying that they were predominantly armed with pikes. The Flemish at Kortrijk or in any other later medieval battle were not predominantly armed with pikes. Maybe at Ginnegate, and at that point, because they had been restrained by the Habsburgs through the Swiss model. In any case, it wasn't any major reform. They kept fighting mostly in more traditional ways, or at least they didn't spark for any military quality until much later in time. So no, the battle of the Golden Spurs, the Battle of Kortrijk, wasn't won by the Flemish because they predominantly had pikes or because they had more pikes than the usual. They had the same exact identical amount of pikes any infantry across Europe had, especially we're talking about Western Europe. Consider that the Flemish militias were also pretty materially affluent. Right, they weren't sort of an explosion of wealth for the equipment of the individual soldier, of course, but in general, right, they were well armed, right? But there is no evidence that pikes were either the majority nor that there was anything different about their pike use than any other army. Also because, let's sort of point to the elephant in the room, the only way you stop a cavalry charge is pikes. All right, you don't stop a cavalry charge, if not with another cavalry charge, with you can say horsemen are using a spear of some sort in any case. But in that sense, the only way you stop cavalry is not halberds, it's not bows, it's pikes, right? Cavalry will actually charge into pikes, and you also have to have pretty strong pikemen and also troops equipped with, for example, the good index behind them, because at some point, ideally, cavalry will stop into the phalanx, and you will have to smash it down with this kind of blunt weapons. But in order to stop the charge frontally, which is not even to be given for granted, because you can have, as all again medievals had when trying to stop cavalry in open field with infantry, pikes in the front, you may actually it's that weapon you have to use, but cavalry is not just trained to charge into them, but also to break through them. In fact, what happened at Kortrijk is that the French actually, and again, the more I study that battle, the more I realize how actually competent the French were. There were better options in a very strategic sense, but still, the French broke the phalanx at Kortrijk. Right? The Flemish win just because they had a little reserve held, by the way, by a knight with other infantry behind that intervened, closing that gap. And actually, the reason why so many French knights die is not much like normally in battle happens. It's not much during the phase of combat, but because in order to charge the Flemish, they had all the time, by the way, to essentially almost completely unmolested cross the ditch, like the canal in front of the Flemish battle line. And when they were repulsed, they unmasked by the canal, and at that point the Flemish broke their infantry, their line. They chased them. They opened the order and they cut them to pieces with weapons like Guden, axes, and so on. And actually, at Mont-en-Pavel, they also paid for that because the same thing more or less happened. But since there wasn't an actual barrier in front of them, they opened the phalanx and chased the French. The French organized a counterattack, and then everything ended into a draw. The Battle of Kortrijk was the only actual proper victory. That the Mont-en-Pavel was some kind of sort of draw. The Flemish are going to be beaten without any single exception. This is one of the most. This is actually the only striking series of uninterrupted defeats that long in medieval warfare against French armies. That is the Burgundian ones until Ginnegate, because of the Swiss model. The Flemish barely changed anything about their army composition. There were always infantry phalanxes with pikes in the front, etc. They increased a little bit their artillery. They were always steamrolled without any exception whatsoever by French feudal armies throughout all the rest of their medieval history. Without any exception. I can't stress that enough. So again, those were the same armies of Kortrijk, and they were absolutely annihilated by the French and French cavalry for that matter. So Kortrijk actually has not much to do with pikes at all. right? Pikes are not anywhere the size of like any weapon isn't actually. And so that's not really a brilliant example if we want to say, okay, well, it's because of pikes, right? And Easton says, even before the widespread adoption of firearms, pikes were already a really good way of particularly militias and relatively low-class soldiers. A way of them balancing the power balance when the main opponent is using heavy cavalry. Indeed, some of you will already... so let me see what he said in particular here. It could be... it's overall correct, but again, pikes are not predominant. Pikes are predominant in the front ranks. The first 3-4 ranks are pikemen. Then you want to have the smashers behind, and then some more likely armed troops further back in the phalanx. But that's not majority, and especially, again, they stand firm there. They don't really do much with that pike eventually, other than trying to stop the cavalry charge that, again, is trained to charge into the pikes, because that's the only way you can actually knock out these guys. And so it's never about the weapon, it's about moral forces and how much these guys can hold their ground. As we've seen, even in a such unfavorable situation like the one of Courtraic's terrain, the French managed to break that phalanx. So I don't think there is much to add. So he says, a way to balance the power balance when the main opponent... Okay. Indeed, he says, some of you will already have thought about the famous scene from the movie Braveheart. Yes, for all of its other historical inaccuracies, that's one thing they sort of get right. I agree, by the way. I like very much the scene of Stirling Bridge without a bridge. Let's leave aside Stirling and a beautiful landscape of that battlefield, but let's say the scene in which the English start advancing with cavalry is actually one of the best cinematic renditions of that kind of thing. I mean, the whole thing of those guys hiding the pikes and taking them up at the last moment is idiotic. Things went very differently, including this, at Bannockburn, etc. Like, again, the Chiltern, like, even witness English cavalry units circling around the enemy, the Scottish formation, trying to spot the weaker part of the perimeter of pikemen to eventually charge into them, just for telling you how things were practically done. But I agree with Easton regarding this. I loved the movie for, again, never evaluate a movie for its historical accuracy, but mostly its artistic value, right? Aside from the fact that historically they all suck in general, but even ones that are supposed to be kind of better, look at Outlaw King, etc. They're just shows for the mentally fragile that do not have anything like to do with any kind of military historical competence or whatever. Easton says the fact that they used Chilterns, I wouldn't necessarily say, like in Braveheart, they were just chopped down saplings, but they were essentially an early form of pikesh long spear pike. So admittedly, and I would like to say that actually pikes did actually increase in length, especially during the 13th century. All right, there is probably a competition in knightly infantry arms, probably spear technology for more or less being of the same length. So actually by the time of, say, Braveheart, that length is actually quite accurate. Actually, like the Scots in the movie look like a bunch of sort of beggars, where actually were much sort of not necessarily better equipped, but they would be equipped in a different way, not surely with this sort of pikes just cut from some nearby wood or whatever, right? So they have to show you they're a bit beggars, because again, the common people must watch the movie, so they have to think it's all about that. But it's not really how things went. So actually, I wouldn't say that pikes were that short at all. In fact, if you look at late communal Italian armies, you find pikes of 5-6 meters were actually basically of the same length that would be used in the Renaissance. And there isn't much of a difference even historically. When you look at, for example, the Saraceni back in the day, there are issues with the reconstruction in terms of the units of measure, but it's basically recognized historiographically that even the famed Saraceni were just like something like 4 or 5 meters long. They weren't this incredibly long pike, like 8 meters or whatever. So it would be something to be said about that. And definitely, actually, very long pikes existed in the most advanced armies of the time. In fact, the Italians had stronger infantries out there, especially at the time, and they first of all, they never dreamt to go to war without cavalry because they had it. They were not like the Flemish in their sort of bourgeois establishment. Secondly, they actually could field massive amount of these troops, right? It's been estimated that there were, I don't know, 30,000 infantry. It's very common actually for the larger regional Italian armies of the period, of the late 13th, early 14th century. 10,000 were pikemen, the so-called lancialunghe, which were, like, we are pretty well documented about their length. And if you think about it, it's, again, more like in a single army. Essentially, most of the Swiss armies in the Renaissance per size, right? They contained, at the peak of medieval civilization, like in the larger medieval armies, what was the normal army in the Renaissance. And I made also some video about this, explaining actually size, and it's fascinating. But nobody really talks about that. So everybody hears about Kortrijk, if you prefer in Flemish, or Bannockburn, or whatever, Stirling Bridge, but they don't really talk much about what did other armies do, right? This is something you should ask yourself all the time, because otherwise you can't give a proper dimension to the armies you're studying, for that matter. In fact, Easton goes deeper, and this is obviously the British ethnographic perspective. He says, admittedly, the Schiltrons weren't, I usually say Skiltrons, but I mean, I'm not claiming to be right, which weren't only used by the Scots, but also by the Northern Welsh. Yes, because there is this story that, the Northern Welsh were about pikes, and the Southern about archers, right? And it's just like one source claiming that, and obviously it doesn't mean anything, but the fact that actually obviously the most powerful Welsh were the Northerners, and so they had sort of better heavy infantry, surprise, surprise. And obviously, those who were regarded as being better archers, they sucked, in the contest. In fact, Easton says, in fact, the Southern Welsh were famous for longbows, but Northern Welsh were famous for long spears. And so in the myth, we debunked this, and there are lots of English, proper English of England, literally not even British scholars, that thoroughly debunked the complete nonsense that the Welsh were in any way better, or worse for that matter, archers than English during, say, the 13th century, previous century. It's a complete and utter BS. Right? In fact, there were lots of Welsh in English armies at the time. It was mostly due to the fact that the Welsh were poorer, and so the Celtic French provided this cannon fodder, sort of cavalry fodder, so to say, for their adventures, like overseas. But the question is, like, no, that there isn't anything particularly more advanced about. Actually, the English archers were paid better than the Welsh, but in any case. So Easton says they were known as spearmen. These were, of course, in late 200s. So he's talking about the Welsh. So Edward I, in his wars in Wales, but also his wars in Scotland, had encountered these Schiltrons, and you could absolutely regard these as a very similar solution to the problem. This much is true, that in the development of the tactics of the English armies of the 100 Years' War, I'm preparing a video about Edward III, for that matter. Let's say the fact that apparently British armies in general, and the English ones that invaded Scotland, for example, had consistent amount of archers, turned out to be pretty useful when the Scots enclosed themselves in their Schiltrons. All right, but there was nothing doctrinal about it, right? Other armies would have used, I don't know, crossbow, and so the idea of English particularism in this sense is pretty overrated. Not in the sense that English armies weren't among the greatest in the history of the art of war during the 100 Years' War, in terms of symmetry, so material homogeneity between France and England, for example, during the war. If you look at the victories of Edward III's time, the English armies, on paper, is actually the strongest, considering the disparity in numbers with the enemy in the entire history of war, right? And I'm not exaggerating, so I'm not saying that in absolute terms the army of Edward III was the strongest or that whatever, but it's enormous, it's impressive. What people never understand about this, though, is that those successes has literally nothing to do with the longbow, right? They could have had another weapon, it would have gone the same way, all right? There is too much technologies, and people think had they had crossbows, as they had on certain occasions, they would have done well. Look at Poitiers. They had lots of Gascons, right? They had crossbowmen themselves. So it's not about the weapon. It's about the politics. It's about the doctrine, etc. Easton is actually going to address this in a while to explain why pikes increase in importance at this point in history. So he says, you're talking about primarily an infantry force that don't have a lot of cavalry, and did a lot of other equips. So he's talking about the Scots here. They're not particularly wealthy, but they can't get pikes and hold a large cavalry force. So Scotland, Wales, Flanders, we see so he's overly emphasized perhaps the fact that they use pikes more than others. They didn't, right? It was the same proportion. We see a pattern emerging of these sort of citizens' armies or militias. We could call them raised, given pikes, and able to hold their own against far more resource and economically advantaged armies. Well, this happens again in literally the more economically advantaged armies, including the Italian ones, as far as their infantry was concerned. In fact, after the Battle of Courtrai, Philip IV of France hires a big deal of Italian infantry that actually, when they get to Flanders, we have chronicles stating that they were dramatically impressing the locals that had never seen the pikes that the Italians used. And those were the same guys who had defeated the French at Courtrai, surprising themselves. So this foretelling you how much we may have sort of misconceive certain things. So it's not just about militias, all militias were equipped like that at the time. If you look at the iconography of early 14th century infantry, they all look like the same. Like there is a bassinet, there is coat of mail, at least those would have been the better equipped ones, but the pikes, that's it. They were Western Europeans they were fighting all in the same way, right? The point is, again, here we'll get to it, collective training, whatever. Easton says, and this is also, of course, what the Swiss were doing. So even leaving firearms out of it for a second, it's fair to point out that whether it's the Swiss who don't have as much armor or cavalry equipment necessarily, the people they were fighting against from the Holy Roman Empire, or indeed the Burgundians later on, or indeed we're talking about the Scots, who were relatively poor compared to the English at the time, the Northern Welsh, or the Northern Welsh, excuse me, some kind of situation. We can see that the pike is a kind of leveler. It is a way of raising a large number of men. In many cases, we don't have much armor. That's also important as well, because if you're using a very long pike, you're keeping your enemies, whether they be cavalry or other infantry, along this. Again, it was happening in the same identical way all across Western Europe. It wasn't a single infantry that fought in a different way. Maybe in the very far Celtic French, like in Ireland, still had javeliners or stuff like that. But the entire Western European military worked with infantry with pikes, including also the best equipped and armored infantry. Like there, it's not about the cheap militia per se. Of course, militia is militia, but it is literally universal at this point. So it's not just about the Scots or or even the much better equipped forces of other countries would use pikes in that way, because it's the only weapon that you normally used in the Middle Ages, or how the art of war has normalized, right? It's not about this, oh my God, we found that the pike works because we have less armor, man. Like, no, right? This is universal, again, in nature. So Easton says, so you can argue that being well equipped in terms of armor is less important for the pikeman than it is for something like a halberdier, someone using a sword and shield. Well, this much is true, obviously. So the fact is that pikes go hand in hand with these sometimes slightly economically disadvantaged or even impoverished armies fighting against these very wealthy medieval armies who have all the armor and all the cavalry. Again, no, there is nothing particular that tells us that they won because they had pikes or more pikes or because they were poor. No, everybody used that. There are other instances, again, of pikemen fighting against the cavalry. Actually, again, the entire pike and sort of spear technology in these centuries, the 13th to 14th, revolves around the competition between which weapon was longer. That wasn't the decisive thing. It was just a suitable development between cavalry and infantry. This is pretty ubiquitous. It's happening also in other parts of the world, telling the truth. So again, there is nothing in particular about being impoverished that makes you use the pike at all. Easton says, but ironically, the Swiss made large use of crossbow. No. All right, it says, famous from William Tell, of course, in Firearms. Okay, for William Tell, it's just a tale where you have a normal person who's using a missile weapon. What a surprise. Missile weapons were used pretty much everywhere. Again, but this makes you think that the Swiss made large use of crossbows. There isn't evidence of this, right? The Swiss made larger use of crossbows, say, than, I don't know, the Franconians or the Lombards or the Burgundians or the Austrians. There is no evidence to state that. What the Swiss really cared about was actually trying to ambush much superior forces and to get into hand-to-hand combat at that point as quickly as possible, as the enemy found itself in a condition of inferiority caused by that unforeseen asymmetry, right? Again, even had they used even a particularly large use of crossbows, it's not a good signal for the fitness of their army, because they would have had just light infantry, and so not much to oppose the heavies that the enemy had. My impression is that the Swiss actually made even less use of crossbows than, say, the Habsburgs who were fighting against them, for that matter. So Easton says, if you have a force which has lots of pikes, not very much armor, but you have a bunch of guns and you have a bunch of crossbows, yet again, the armor is even less important because of the armor of your opponent is not even able to stop the guns. Okay, so there is some armor which is bulletproof, admittedly, but the majority of armor is going to be far more vulnerable to your guns than it would have been to, for example, longbow arrows. Yes, this is what we were saying before. Crossbows, he doesn't distinguish much the 14th to 15th century Swiss. In any case, it doesn't really matter right now. He says crossbows can give a slightly higher rate of fire than the guns can. So they are very good for wounding horses or wounding lesser armored people, but, the crossbows, yes, of course, compared to the guns. But the fact that you've got guns in conjunction with your pikes makes you not only defensively very strong, but also offensively very potent, even against armored foes, right? And he's making the statement here, it seems to me, that when you listen to the video also, that it makes you very offensively powerful because you have guns. No, like by the time of the Burgundian Wars, you're not offensively powerful because you have guns. All right, no army was offensively powerful because it had guns. They were offensively powerful because they had cavalry and they had the infantry. I mean, heavy infantry and heavy cavalry. Easton says, and of course, because that's what the pikes are for. They advance. That's the biggest deal of the Swiss at this point. For the first time, all right, from antiquity, infantry has enough collective training to wield pikes in a mass formation and push through the enemy and not stopping there, just fearing a cavalry charge. This is extremely important. It's the pike. It's not the shot that makes you aggressively powerful. The pike was not sitting there awaiting for the shot to finish the job. It didn't work like that. Without mentioning, at this time also, arquebuses, yes, were important, but they were not so even overwhelmingly functional in general as missile weapons in order to be relevant. Like, you have really to wait another bit of decades for that to be sort of evident. Easton says that, of course, while the Swiss were early adopters of this in late 1400s, again, there is not really much evidence of this at all. Again, early adopters compared to whom? Like, other peoples used guns for quite a long time. All right, and so he's also talking about the pikes here, admittedly, right? But he's, as we just said, he doubles down the concept that the Swiss basically came up with pike and shot, and that's not the case. The Swiss are pike. Pike and shot is post-Swiss, all right? It's what beats the Swiss in a way. It says, by the end of the 1400s, loads of nations all over Europe were copying this way of fighting. And again, I would like to point out, as we also explained in that video about the art of war, is that in the moment, actually, there aren't many people that are really copying the Swiss per se, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Swiss warfare was fairly limited in range, right? They basically defeated the Burgundians, also pretty close to home, because technically the Burgundians had invaded Switzerland, or at least they also fought in there. And during the Italian Wars, at the service of the French. Their pike columns absolutely did show how it was done. The Langsknechte were modeled over that, etc. But overall, right, you don't simply create that, and this is the second point, out of nothing. Again, pikemen had always been there. If you look at the condottas, for example, or the ordinances of Charles the Bold, if you look, there is always a consistent pike component in all those armies. Infantry, again, regularly fights with pikes, next to other weapons, of course, but still, like for the anti-cavalry purpose that we described before, right? So what these European nations basically realize, as we'll see now, and also Easton explains, that they have unprecedented power concentration, and so they can start properly and quasi-doctrinally inform their forces with a specific type of tactical training, gear, and overall role, all right? That's it. But this means that there were lots, in fact, of pikemen that were already ready for that purpose, to be co-opted in that fashion. So it's not like the Swiss invent this and everybody says, oh, but we have to copy it. It sort of happened, similar to that, especially for the Landsknechte. But say, I don't know, if you look at the Spanish, if you look at the Italians, if you look at also other people, when we look at Central, Northern Europe, they were also keeping to fight, frankly, in a medieval fashion for a long time. We've seen even during the German peasant revolt, the Lorrainese army intervened with an army that had, like 1,000, say 1 to 3 in terms of 1 to 2 actually of cavalry, heavy cavalry, and infantry. So some countries, even in relatively developed places, were still oblivious. Like they didn't even have the resources likely to have large pike squares. In fact, this is also a bit underrated in the picture, that there were armies that could beat still the pike and shot in certain circumstances. Right, think about the Polish against the Swedes, also much later in time. Again, it's not just having a pike, also because, again, the resources that sovereigns have at their disposal are not enough to simply create their own army. This is something that happens only from the time of Louis XIV in the second half of the 17th century. It's a nationalization of armies that basically, are still essentially privately raised in a way that there is a subcontract, etc., but they are all kind of uniform in a significant fashion and paid by the state, right? At this point, kings, emperors could basically just provide with a core of royal troops, and then you would have still to just hire other troops or fight with those militias, and so those weren't normally equipped at large altogether to have simply the pike and shot tactics, even though again, some countries were more advanced, could afford that more. For example, the Spanish, also because they had an enormous power at that point, as you know, with the Americas, with the dynastic collection of, different parts of the Mediterranean crown and so on. So for a long time, like pike and shot is also like a standardized pike and shot, not quite. In fact, a great deal of modern historiography on the subject revolves around sort of assessing the discrepancy between what military manuals were sort of ideally issuing and what was the reality of actual warfare in combat. Because the same Matt Easton said in his past video about how we've been looking at medieval archers the wrong way. Of course, there were different roles that these troops could definitely have at the same time. And most of them also fought often in circumstances were not like the typical pitched battle where you could test combined arms tactics. And everything was messier for a long time, forever, let's say, than what pure doctrine at this point was not even conceptualized. In fact, in theory and practice, would have said, right? So this is it. And Easton goes further, says, and even the Swiss enemies, so the enemies of the Swiss, the Burgundians, would they defeated. Incidentally, the Burgundians even adopted from 1471. He's talking about, here again, so he's talking about the pike and shot. It says, so quite early from 1471, they adopted 1/8 of their army as pikemen, right? And so again, I would like to stress, those are the ordinances, and it's completely normal for 1/8 or even more, actually, of their infantry to be pikemen. Again, the Italians had 1/3. In the late 13th, early 14th century, the Burgundians always had pikemen in their forces, and at some point, I'm even sure, like they would have been, again, more or less of the same ratio. So this had actually nothing to do with the Swiss at this point. Secondly, the enmassing of heavier forces is something that is visibly happening in the armies of the time compared to ones of the previous generations. Armies are becoming larger, more structured. You can easily see it. We've made lots of videos about late medieval armies, sort of composition, training, recruitment, and so on. So this is not sort of what makes the Swiss unique is that most of their infantry was made of pikemen. So much so that the rest also were halberdiers. And as we said before, these units, they would have had large amounts of shots or crossbow. Nah, right? They had a minimal amount of skirmishers. They didn't even need anything more sophisticated. They didn't have artillery. They didn't have cavalry. They were just fully into the... obviously, they would have had some minimal cavalry, minimal artillery. All right? But again, it's that secondary or even tertiary. In the case of the Swiss in particular, exactly because the Swiss are exceptional because they were mostly just about heavy infantry, right? And a large amount of them pikemen. So again, it has nothing to do with what the Burgundians were already doing by themselves without the Swiss telling them, all right? In fact, this is, as Easton says, before the same wars. Burgundian armies were very much sophisticated, were among the most advanced of the era, and pikes were there. We see it also throughout many iconographic sources. Then Easton says, so looking at the two last points, so the fact that firearms are very important, and also the fact that this weapon that's very useful for people who maybe don't have as much money or equipment or heavy cavalry. So again, you want to consider something that these people were actually recruited from princes like the Holy Roman Emperor, like the King of France, etc. Had a lot of money, had ideally lots of cavalry they could field, and they start actually using their own turn these levies into professionals with their own money, and it actually costs a big deal. And this is the entire point of the war, to be able to equip these people, providing with their own equipment. Easton says that later, but he's making it sound like just because these people were poor. Actually not. Even if you look at the Swiss, they were individually poor, but overall they were a big country by this point, and there were enough resources, especially in the great banking cities that were at the head of the Confederacy, that could provide with the means to train these people. There was also a strong esprit de corps and sort of general national cohesion. That's actually what matters in warfare more than else. So there were reasons for that. But this type of troops actually will be fielded by the most affluent powers in Europe, simply because nobody else could afford otherwise heavy these pike squares as they will become. On top of that, with the shot even. I also made a video, for example, about Habsburgic artillery, right? Catholic German artillery from the time of Maximilian, the same time, to the 30 Years' War. So if you're interested, and they didn't have even that much money to begin with, but still, because in fact pikemen were more important, Landsknechte were more important. Easton says there was another thing emerging at this time, and that is armored cavalry. I also disagree about this. I will see now how. Now, obviously, armored knights had existed for a long time, yeah, of course, but what we see at the end of the 1400s, and especially in the 1500s, is the increasing use of horse armor. This actually was starting from the end of the 13th century, which actually is the moment in which sort of the great medieval civilization starts stalling before it crashes in the mid-14th. And there had been a great deal of, say, the higher level of armoredness is actually in the 15th century overall, right? And Easton actually knows this because, at least, even though he talks mostly about infantry, he often points that out for the 15th century with brigandines and everything. And actually what happens by the 16th century is that, think about the same Maximilian armor, is that there is an ultra-elite of cavalry. Whereas, and this had already started from the 15th century, even from the 14th, that the heavily armored cavalry was ever less numerous, and that cavalry had been splitting in sort of different tactically supporting functions, which is the segmentation we're observing also with the pikes or the infantry, for example, in the very varied, very sort of stratified, for example, Burgundian lances, right? So it's true that peoples like the French, that in any case did not fight normally against the Swiss, that had the gendarmes, for example, but those were actually being obliterated from the field by pikes primarily, and also from the shot in a combined arm tactics eventually. And so cavalry is not so relevant as it was before already. Now, probably Easton makes it overlap with, in fact, with the rise of these weapons, but in general, the notion that cavalry, say there was more armored cavalry in absolute terms in the 15th century than in the 16th. That there is no doubt about this, and it's simply because quantitatively speaking, there was much less cavalry around, and to have ultra elite cavalry, you had to have necessarily more lighter cavalry supporting it, because you can't, unless again you have things like again smaller big cavalry. Think even about the Reiter or other cuirassiers in general. But those are really small, and by the mid-16th century, probably there's the greatest contraction of cavalry force. So even if you have more armored cavalry, how important is that really? And Easton says this, of course, made them, this heavier, more heavily armored cavalry, less vulnerable to archery, both longbows and crossbows. However, they're still vulnerable to guns, and this is relative. Yes, there are lots of knights that are shot dead, as we've seen with Giovanni de' Medici, or you have Bayard more famously. There are lots of sort of famous now. Think about Jacques de la Langue. They symbolize a bit land of chivalry. They are shot, right, by different type of firearms. In any case, in general, arquebus volleys did not stop cavalry, all right? Because, surprise, surprise, the lights do not stop cavalry. Even with the development of firearms, of course, firearms will become superior to cavalry, but much later, right? We will see it from the basically the late 17th century alone, and that there is actually a lot of cavalry warfare, very powerful proportions of cavalry back in the field at that point. But in any case, we are before. Easton says, if you are facing a very rich army, let's say the French army, for example, or the Holy Roman Empire, who can field the large force of heavy barded, very well-armored cavalry, then potentially pikes are a really important way for not very much money of holding them at bay. Again, pikes were already there, all right? Now, of course, Easton says you can't necessarily stab through the armor of the horse or the rider with a pike, but what you can do is you can prevent them from breaking your formation. If you have a large block of pikes, you can't keep the horses at bay and keep them away. What happens during that time, your people with arquebuses and later on muskets are shooting them. So the pike has a very important part to play, not just in poking people with a pointy end, but at keeping horses away, first of all, from your gunners, but also away from you. So at least, I appreciate what he says here, but also away from you, because that is inherently what makes you decisive as heavy infantry. It has barely to do with gunners. You want to protect gunners. Gunners are also often exposed, like they're deployed as sleeves or even as sort of at the corner, as squares at the corner of the same pike square. So sometimes they are really exposed, and they have ways, like in loose formation, even to take refuge behind the pikes, etc. But overall, what matters is the pike. It's not much about what the gunners do at this point. Easton says, and it doesn't really matter how well armored those horsemen are. If they can't reach you with their lances, but you can't push them away with your pikes. And by the way, I would say this, that the type of heavily armored cavalry that we're looking at now, the Maximilian armored one, for example, they were conceived, again, as an ultra-elite to exactly withstand arquebuses shot, especially at a distance when projectiles were spent, right? And it worked, actually. So, bullets will arrive, will be dangerous and whatever, but still, again, you can't take down cavalry with arquebusiers at this point in history, all right? Otherwise, they would have simply switched to arquebusiers, and you would have already had linear tactics in the early 16th century, end of the story, all right? That's not the case. Pikes were there for a reason, and it wasn't shielding the arquebusiers, it was being the decisive arm in open field for advancing and aggressing, right? So much so that even when, in fact, you have pike and shot armies fighting against one another, let's leave aside the role of cavalry was always very important. We've seen it in battles like the one of Dreux, for example, for the French wars of religion. But the standard tactic is the defender sits there, the attacker advances and is shot at by enemy gunners. And pikes exist in the art of war as long as that pike formation remains, even taking these losses, functional to take on the enemy pikemen, right? And arquebusiers have to deal with the fact that they can't dislodge the pikemen from the field, all right, until the pikeman in that sense exists and does not transform himself into a shooter, which happens much later. Easton says, and remember, it's not just one person with a pike, it's an entire block of overlapping ranks all pushing those horses away. Easton says, if you're able to do that and shoot into them at the same time, that's a very effective way of dealing with this very potent and dangerous fully armored cavalry, which was around at the time. At the time, there would also be the Reiter, for example. So you have gunners on horseback. How do you cope with those? They shoot at you. Also, Politcrow's range, which was their habitual tactic, properly, they shoot at the pikemen, at very close range. At the end, they would actually throw their own pistols on their heads. Right? So we're telling you that they would risk being shot, but that was not really this enormous risk, as a matter of fact, compared to the pike, like were to fall into them. Easton says, now, these are all good tactical reasons to have pikemen and have pike blocks in your army, and a good explanation of why they suddenly reappeared at this time. Again, this is not the reason. All right, pikemen, if anything, cavalry was adapting to infantry already, and pikes were to develop in any case because they were the most sort of collectively effective thing to do, right? And this would have happened, say, in an ideal world, even if, I don't know, firearms had not existed or something, right? Surely armies would have looked something different, but say the availability of troops to attack cavalry, if there's a greater capacity to train infantry, unlike in the previous eras when states were more sort of less effective, right, more deficient, is what you want to go for. Easton says, but there is another way of looking at it as well. Society was changing. Yes, I agree with this. This is actually the best answer, even though, again, Easton here literally tells us what he mostly thinks this is all about, which is, I will summarize, society, economy, and technology. I would say things like society, politics, and moral forces or institutions in any case. Anyway. Yes, of course, there were economical, technological factors, but it was subordinated to some bigger picture. In fact, this is incredibly important to stress, that technologies adapt to tactics. And this is what, and not the other way around. There's this, that everybody with a minimal education in history of economics and history of technology knows that in the sense weapons, speaking of warfare, are introduced for a specific purpose, as opposed to simply there is a technology and that immediately translates into a weapon. All right, technology without doctrine is zero. It has no value whatsoever. All right. Now, Easton says countries and economies and banking and all sorts of other things were changing at this time. And what we do find is that the nature of the raising and managing and funding and keeping in the field of armies in the 16th century seems to become a little more modern fundamentally. Where into the early modern world, it is clear that pike blocks require a certain amount of training and coordination to be effective. Firstly, this is a medieval rabble of people with an assortment of hand weapons, which in general, like medieval armies quite weren't in, but I get the contrast that he's drawing here. They have all got the same weapon. And this is not even true. Actually, for the Renaissance, there's always a differentiation in weapons. There are pikemen, there are halberdiers, there are other kind of side weapons, or even shields still, and swords, and long bows, and composite bows, and crossbows, even. So for a while, right? So it's not fully the case. Tendentially, that's ideally where we should get, but not even today. Every soldier is literally 100% equipped in the same identical way, or a unit is just like not customized in a way. Easton says in many cases they've got the same armor. This is also not 100% true. Depends on at least the scale. Obviously, there was a level of uniformity already, but it's going to take a while before it really becomes something like in a modern, sort of modernistically intended. In many cases, Easton says, their equipment of all of their armor and weapons were actually kept in state arsenals or even local armors. We even have some of them still surviving in places like Graz in Austria. Yeah, I love that armory. At some point I could even post pictures from it. And I also made a video about medieval Styria, so if you're interested, you can check that out. Even though it doesn't talk about the modern age. I talk about Styria in general in the videos about the Habsburgs for the Renaissance, so you can check that out as well. Easton says, so if they are being centrally provided for, centrally equipped, centrally organized, and the amount of administration behind this, they're also being to some degree centrally trained. And that's what you need for pikemen, because the pike is not a haphazard weapon. It's not a weapon that can be wiggled around and used instinctively. The pikeman must act as a coordinated trained block, and so for that reason we see in the 16th and 17th century we start to see pike drill. So just the same as the 19th century, we've got cutlass drill and bayonet drill and marching and all this kind of stuff. And the way he says this, and also when you watch the videos, as if, it's mostly about how you fight with a pike. And that's not quite the point. It's mostly how you march with a pike, how you reform. That's what matters. Because actually pike fencing is incredibly primitive, right? There is no comparison with obviously a sword, but even just, I don't know, a poleaxe of other kind. Like with the pike, you just stab and push. Like there isn't much else to do. And in fact, this is the product of the drop, like in actual absolute intensity of training from an individual soldier standpoint, and more like the maximization of the collective training. I made lots of videos about early modern warfare and how probably there was all an ethos that was tending to sort of reduce the soldier to an automaton, right? For example, also Protestant morality was hinting at this, that your works are useless, you just have to obey for some reason and die. If there is a cannonball that smashes you don't have to move. It can even be useful, I will not deny. That's why the fantassin of the 18th century could go around the world, and he would have been cut to pieces by an average sort of savage with an axe or whatever. But obviously in a collective training, he was literally he was capable to literally obliterate all those peoples out there. So it's not always telling the truth, but still with a staggering superiority. So that's exactly the point. Collective training, and this was true also in the Middle Ages, right? Collective training beats such thing like the heroicism or the ideal sort of championism of the individual. That never really happened, not even in the Bronze Age or wherever we know. There was always somebody fighting alongside who would combine very close-knit fashion with a leader even. Easton says in the 16th century we would start to see the increasing kind of modern view of training soldiers that we're more familiar with now. And that's what you need for pike blocks to work. That's what Alexander the Great, that's what they had in the ancient world. And indeed, the Renaissance saw the rebirth exactly as the name, as it says on the tin, the Renaissance, the rebirth of that idea. So the professionalization. Now, in most cases, they weren't standing armies, so to speak, but they did go through pike drill, and pike drill is an important element to pike blocks working, and the pike being very important. So he actually, I don't remember, no, he says it now. So it's part of a sociological, economical, and technological, this it says, in some cases, change and development that was happening in the 16th century particularly. So you see how he thinks, like it's a sociological, yes, if you may have a broader, all-encompassing idea of society, maybe encompasses politics, but then why adding economical or technological? It's like saying, where's politics here? He is correct in saying that it's an overarching mechanism, but it's mostly politics, Clausewitzianly speaking, to say the least. And then social things and economical and technological play, but there is also the state, there is the institution, and more. All right, and there is, generally speaking, the precondition, the ancien regime, how this had come about historically, etc., that really allows for even all these people to obey, for example, a single ruler, as opposed to the Middle Ages, where this wasn't that easy to achieve, right? So actually, the question, why did pike reappear, is not really answered. Also because this is the actual answer. This is the politological thing. It's not weapons, right? It's not technology influencing other technology and how they vote. It's actually politics, society. That's the actual reason why they reemerged. all right, rather than anything that was actually happening on the battlefield. This is the most important thing to you. Some of you would be surprised. This is literally the single most important thing to answer that question. Easton continues, says, you really can't have people wiggling around pikes and being attacked from the flank. You've got to have them knowing how to maneuver the pike to change front and present the pikes down in a new direction. So here, if you watch the video, he does some, like, he literally stands there with a pike frontally and he turns 90 degrees on the right? And I don't know if he's serious about this, but he's basically alluding to the fact that if you have to change front, say being attacked at the flank, you have to be trained to just turn right and reform the formation like that. You know that doesn't happen, right? There is an internal disposition of people in depth and width that does not allow you to change front like that, right? There was a terrible video that circulated on the internet several years ago from one of those himists in a gym, whatever, that was showing, like, I don't know, 8 people on two lines, so 2 people per row, and they were literally just turning 180 degrees, allegedly dispatching this video for something like, this is how actually they change from it. No formation was able to do that, and second, for a very specific reason, that the file openers were the ones that were effectively there, and the others had to follow. If you change formation like that, you just basically destroy your combat capacity, for that matter. There is the counter march that we have seen also in the video about the Spartan drill, that was also partly resumed from those classical texts in the Renaissance, but mostly to change people from the front, or to properly, in fact, realign, having the file opener, in fact, making this turn and redeploy the unit on changing literally the front by 180 degrees. You have to make the entire file move around, and it's very complex. It requires a lot of training. You don't change front of the formation or shape of the formation by turning the individual soldier from that direction. It does not work. I don't know if Easton, he must be aware of that, but if you wanted to change a front, you would have to literally move the entire formation at that point. You would have to redeploy. Right, and we know this very well. Like, there are very sort of explicit ways we know Renaissance armies deployed on the battlefield, and that those were the actual maneuvers that these troops were intensely trained to perform on the parade grounds of the emerging, monarchic, caserne and so on, that will eventually characterize better modern warfare. Right, so definitely you need a bit more of training to change fashion that way. So again, I don't know. I saw him doing that thing in the video. I hope he knows that obviously that has nothing to do with how you change. You're attacked from the flank. If you're attacked from the flank on the battlefield, you're done for. All right. There isn't a situation, even with perfectly drilled troops, that tell, oh my God, somebody's attacking from the flank. We hadn't seen him, and now we can reform. You're done for. It's basically what happens also to the Burgundians with the Swiss, and that's why the Swiss, why? Because they were so speedy. Nobody had thought infantry could simply appear from nowhere and attack with a column, mostly with, again, these file openers that are followed by the trail of other infantry that eventually will have to push, breaking through everything, right? Obviously, in a broader sense, if you have, I don't know, you see on a hill kilometers away an enemy approaching, yes, of course, throughout the modern age, you have all the kind of redeployment possible, but again, this happened with very sort of specific warning, etc. You have entire battles, including during the Middle Ages, where there were some troops drawn up and for battle in a certain direction, the enemy army appeared from the flank, and they had no idea. It's not even that they were that close in the moment in which they spawned, but let's say medieval armies in that case did not have enough collective training to simply reform after they had already formed the battle lines. At the same time, they could also be more flexible than we think. And especially infantry was much better drilled than we think, generally speaking. During the Middle Ages, they advanced, they reached everywhere. There's plenty of cases of this. For example, Bannockburn, that came up later, before, does witness, I think, a couple of days before the battle, an English attack trying to outflank it. There is a literal infantry unit that comes to block the English movements alone, but it was on a longer, sort of on a broader field, right, in a broader theater. But just for this, don't underestimate how actually already drilled certain medieval infantries really were. Easton says you have to do it in a coordinated fashion, which requires training more akin to what you use. Okay. It wasn't really until the end of the 15th century we really start to see the systems in place to enable the coordinated training, preparation, and deployment of pike blocks. Now, another reason why pikes were particularly successful from the end of the 15th century through the 16th and well to the 17th century is because let's think back to the ancient period. So one of the things that the Romans did to overcome pike blocks was to use large shields. The Romans couldn't like this here. Okay, so this is another thing of Easton that I don't really understand. Like he believes fundamentally that the Romans were so successful in many ways against the Hellenistic Macedonian phalanx because they had a broad shield. Now, there is no doubt that a broad shield, as Easton points out here, is useful in that circumstance, but the notion that there would be this dramatic factor, it was particularly about the Roman. I mean, the entire continental Europe used the same type of, more or less, of shield. If you look at the Celts, at the Iberians, the Italic, they all had the type of shield, all right? And he's actually showing a Roman scutum of the sort of shingle type from most of the early imperial period that is very enveloping, actually. And the shield before was sort of slightly slender. It was, yes, more, it was still encompassing, whatever. It was rugged and it was pretty tough. And yeah, this is the case. But I mean, even a Celtic spearman would have used that, right? As it happened, as sometimes they fought also in Greece against the Macedonians, whatever, during their migration. So I made a video about how Romans and Macedonians, or at least Romans and the Hellenistic powers using the Macedonian phalanx fought. I wrote a work about it when I was at university. Nothing particular, but it looks at all the primary sources and it sort of gets to the point, and it barely even talks about weapons, right? Sources do not give a damn about that, right? So to reduce all this military issues like the art of war to weapons, I don't think is very useful. I've always been against this. There is a functionality, but battles were won or lost for reasons that have barely anything to do with that. And surely nothing that even minimally approaches anywhere like decisiveness or whatever. So if you keep pushing this message, look, I can be better protected from those kind of weapons, like any other, by the way. This is how the Romans had it easier against the Hellenistic phalanx. Sorry, but it's not a thing. Let's be serious about this stuff. Like it doesn't explain it, right? If you have a simpleton thinking that that's a major deal, they will go around loud and outspoken as if we hadn't enough of a problem with that, explaining to you how the Romans actually won, because look at the shield, man. See, it's all covering there with those pikes who got into them, and they actually did it because like nobody else kind of did, because the Romans had this kind of thing, and we should stop. I would be for suspending civic rights for people that go around with this kind of mentality. But in any case, this is just me after all. I'm sort of a bit edgier than the Matt Easton is. Obviously, we're always very friendly and sort of very calm, very very tranquil in the way he points out. He's easygoing, and man, that's important, of course. But again, the example here, I don't think it's so fitting. Easton says using a large shield meant that you could close in on a pike formation because it covered enough of your body that you could literally just walk into the pikes, pushing them aside, pushing them over. Okay, that's not how it happened. All right, that's even if they threw themselves into the pikes, etc. They fought it out, right? The phalangite actually had even a capacity to fight frontally, even not just because of the pike. This is often underrated. I know that overall is not quite, in comparison to the Romans, is not quite the same thing, indeed, but don't think it's even that distant, as a matter of fact. I will make more videos about this. But in any case, that's, again, not what the Romans fundamentally won against the Macedonian phalanx, that they never managed to break frontally, unless it had already broken by itself, apparently, in big gaps, not as again, that kind of people I described before thinks the gaps between the units as they normally are for maneuverability. You must leave space between the can do, which exploiting, by the way, renders no advantage to defender whatsoever. And I made multiple videos about this as well. Even one in particular that explains what kind of gaps are exploitable on a battlefield, not the gaps between the units. I don't even qualify that. But in any case, Easton says, so this is what I would almost call this shield, the Roman scutum, as an anti-pike block shield. And it had nothing to do with that. Like, the Romans developed those weapons in times they weren't even fighting against the Greeks. I will talk over extensively because it's one of my favorite topics in whatsoever. It is the genesis of manipular tactics, manipular legion. And you have an idea of how the development of scutum has literally nothing to do with anything concerning the Hellenistics, the Greeks, whatever. And it's a thing that was used all over Europe, and the Celts, the Italics used the same weapons basically, and not because the Romans copied it from the Celts. By the way, the scutum is an Italic thing, as a matter of fact. And it didn't even magically turn out like an anti-pike block shield when they were fighting against the Pizzatari. So let's be honest about this, because this is a very serious topic. I don't concede right on this. Easton says it's an incredibly important invention. Again, it was not an invention. It was just like the gradual development of shields, how they did pretty much also everywhere in Europe at the time. But in addition to that, the Romans actually had, Easton says, really good armor as well. And this is, again, if you look actually at the time when the Romans beat the Hellenistic powers, not even, actually. Like, the Macedons, the Seleucids were beaten, the Pyrrhus as well, even though, again, more or less the Romans did, again, break the phalanx. Right, frontally. That never actually happened. Not even at Pydna. Again, that's the moment in which the phalanx breaks itself in chunks, and the Romans exploit that. It's very different from, we're talking about big gaps, like the ones that say, I don't know, Alexander could exploit at Chaeronea against the Hellenes and so on. And it's not true that Romans had actually pretty good armor at the time. Actually, their front line was constituted by, or heavy infantry was constituted by the Astati that had sort of not much armor to begin with. It is true, telling the truth, that by the 2nd century BC, way before the Marian Reform, and I made multiple videos about this, by the end of the Second Punic War, actually, the average Roman soldier was already standardized alongside the pattern of the princeps. You don't have to wait for Marius. That was already a thing underway. But, right, technically, again, it's just a good equipment. It's nothing excellent in absolute terms. And again, they were so heavy to attack the Hellenistic. No, actually, at that point, the Romano-Italic Confederacy is pretty agile. Again, it hasn't much to do with armor. That's important. It's not like unimportant, but nobody talks about this. Nobody hears. In the original sources, there is no evidence that was ever a thing like that. Oh my God, the Romans were so well armored to fight against the Hellenistic phalanx. They were probably more or less on the same foot, right? And so it's also a factor that annuls itself in the process. Easton says people often overlook, I think, the importance of the armor. Now, whether it's Lorica, Amata, or Lorica, by the way, Amata or Segmentata, or whatever, they were generally speaking well armored, and they were well armored across their legions because they were well centrally funded and equipped, and of course trained, and they had good helmets. And again, this all happened way after the age that the Romans were taking out the Macedonian phalanx. So the combination of this stuff, again, it's not like they had a bad combination of this stuff in quality, but again, it was not what here, even the type of shield show that was around, right? So let's be a bit consistent. And Easton says, so the combination of this type of very large shield, obviously they come in different shapes and sizes, but generally speaking, the Roman shield is a large one covering most of your body, all the way down to your knees, and at least sometimes your shins, and used in conjunction with good armor and helmets, and the fact that they are using a short sword, which wasn't actually that short at all. Like the gladius hispaniensis, say, of the time of Pydna is described also chopping, kinoscephali, etc., like chopping heads, limbs. We know archaeologically these pieces were pretty long, right? They were more similar. They were actually coming from the same mold of the Celtic spathae, right? And the Romans had actually been developing their own thing for quite a while. Even the coppice, it's not even about being straight or this type or another. Also, the curved coppice can chop that, and so it's mostly about how aggressive you actually are, not much what kind of. This is perhaps the greatest misconception that we talked Kortrijk before. According to you, what was important in that battle? How much the Flemish wanted to rip off the French, the guts from the French. All right, that's what matters. It's not even what you have in your hand. Let's stop overly emphasizing the importance of technology. It's been debunked over and over again by the same art of war in the annals of military history. It is not that, right? And so it was not even a short sword. Actually, the Republican legionary of the 2nd century BC was a guy who had a pretty individualistic mindset, even though pretty well regimented already into a heavily disciplined formation. We don't even know what kind of order they fought in. There are just two measures like in Polybius and Vegetius, and Polybius basically describes almost an open order exactly from the time which the Romans were fighting against the Macedonian phalanx. It's a bit schematic. I mean, it's Polybius. And the other Vegetius that talks about almost a phalanx in late Roman times in terms of thickness of the order. But this is notorious. This is sort of very basic information. You should understand that none of this is that relevant. I forgot here even where he was going with this from this morning when I watched the video. So a short sword means that you can close into pike block. So again, not even the case. These are so hard stereotypes to properly demolish. It's so important actually to talk about this stuff for this very reason, right? Because those videos are watched by sometimes even hundreds of thousands of people. Like if you say these things, you're basically spreading some of the most pernicious misconception. It's not about the fact that it's a mistake. I mean, who cares? I'm not, again, attacking Easton for it, but consider the effect of other people. That's important, right? So Easton says, now this was really a thing in the age of the Renaissance pike, because of course pavises existed and pavises had been quite important in the 15th century, but as soon as gunpowder started being used more often, number one shields are far less important because the bullet can going straight through the shield, but in addition the armor is less important. So what we start to see is fewer people using large shields, fewer people using all-encompassing armor as we go into the 16th century. It just goes to make the pike even more potent, because if people are using fewer shields and lighter armor now, the pike is an even more effective weapon. And on that note, I don't want you to think the pike is simply a defensive weapon. They absolutely were used offensively. Obviously, Alexander the Great in the ancient world, phalanxes and pike blocks were used offensively. They could be used, and shield throws were used by the Scots offensively as well. Well, technically, yeah, the Scots did, but mostly they were passive at the time, as we explained before. Again, they could advance with that infantry, but normally they wouldn't engage cavalry like that. Again, so this is actually the big divide between, again, what the Swiss actually come up with, that they actually bring the offensiveness, right? So Easton acknowledges this, says, so they could be used to attack. However, generally speaking, it's not always the case. But generally speaking, in the age of gunpowder, what is your most effective attacking weapon? It's the gunpowder weapons. Wrong. All right, this is false. All right, this is true naturally after the period we're discussing, because the pike disappears for a reason. And at that point, firearms are really that more powerful. 16th century, absolutely not. Right, pike and shot warfare, which is exactly, again, definitionally the time in which pike is still relevant. It is exactly because the most important weapon is the pike, because the pike is the heavy infantry and the shot is the light one. And as long as the pike remains the heavy infantry, the shot does not overcome it. It's that simple. All right. And Easton says, whether it's the field artillery, whether it's the people with handguns or various sort arquebuses and muskets, they are that way of inflicting the greatest casualties on the enemy. False. Right. Greatest casualty on the enemy is stamped for this if we're talking the 18th century. All right, if we're talking the 16th century, it's a very different business. They didn't sit there to get shot. Like, it's pikemen that attacked. You see in beautiful paintings, look at the ones about the Battle of Pavia, you see arquebusiers in an accompanying role, auxiliary one, as they always were. It's the pike that does the job. Plus, there is still cavalry around, and that also beats hard, right? And still, people are massacred. It more or less like in the pursuit with cold steel, right? That's incredibly important. And you're even talking about the field artillery. Not even in the 18th century, field artillery was that. Then you have to wait the end of the 19th century, right? In the 18th century, even field artillery was literally coming after all other arms in terms of death, right? First musket, second cold steel. Artillery was literally the least important of all. So I don't know why here Easton is bunching them all up. Perhaps he was intending the wall, but not even the wall is more powerful. In the 16th century, also in great part of the 17th, even when the numbers of musketeers are greater than one of pikemen, the most important element is actually the pike, right? This is up to the mid-17th century fundamentally. And so, again, I don't understand why he's so tranchant about this. What is so strange? I mean, I think it's a bit of a defensivistic, technologistic mentality. This is, I can't say post-Vietnam War syndrome, but it's the idea that you can't just shoot at the enemy from a sort of defensible position, and that's all basically what warfare is, right? No, like these people went on and attacked. They marched under fire exactly because the pike square could not be stopped by fire before arriving to the pike square on the other side. That is the actual objective to take out. After that, if you are an arquebusiers, you have to get the hell out of the way, and quickly, all right? Without mentioning there is cavalry around, in fact. Easton says, which means that in that context, actually would argue that the pike is primarily defensive in order to put false. The pike is primarily offensive. That's the entire point of pike and shot warfare. That's the entire point of the Swiss. You said it before, you didn't even unbalance yourself. You said basically that the Swiss themselves had pike and shot warfare, and we know that the Swiss were mostly offensive in a tactical sense. So it's not like you couldn't be defensive, especially with the bigger pike squares, and you could await for softening up the enemy formation, but it's not more than what, I don't know, the English archers would do, as we said before, during the Wars of Scottish Independence against the Chilterns. Then you had to charge in with cavalry. It's a completely different story. All right, so this did not change. Again, it's well-established art of war strength ratios that we know it pretty well. So it wasn't primarily defensive at all. All right, it was primarily defensive if there was cavalry around, but given that cavalry had been intimidated, had been reduced and shrunk by that, that's exactly why this pikemen went at other pikemen. It was the primary thing. And yes, one side, obviously defending would defend. That's universal, right? You would do it with any unit. But the other side, it was advancing. It was advancing with pikemen. They weren't offending with... Otherwise, as we said at the very beginning, that's the fundamental premise. Otherwise, we would have had only shooters. And would have had linear tactics in the 16th century. Because at that point, what's the point of the pike, right? To defend from cavalry, you say... again, if the arquebusiers can't defend themselves from cavalry and pikes can, it means that the pike is superior both to cavalry and to the shoot. So, again, it's not even the speed of cavalry that can attack without notice. It's literally the fact that the shot cannot wear out pikes, right, until the mid-17th century. In any meaningful sense. And pikes kind of remain in some ways, but in any case. Easton says, so they would argue that the pike is primarily defensive. It is not the point. In order to protect your people operating guns, essentially, because although you can move forward and attack with the pike number one, you don't want to go too far away from your people with arquebuses, but those normally followed, right? That's exactly what also crossbowmen did with heavy infantry, with longbowmen, with heavy infantry throughout all the Middle Ages. Why would they do anything different in that sense, right? The arquebuses were carried by hand, so they weren't immobile artillery. Even the smaller artillery moved like that at some point from the later Middle Ages. We made videos about that. Easton says, because they're not going to be defended, therefore, and the cavalry can whip in, but in addition to that, poking at people with your pike is not going to cause an enormous number of casualties compared to what those guys reloading and shooting can do. Are you sure? You're sure. You're advancing like with hundreds of men with pikes in the front, and you're attacking other pikemen. And by the way, they're armored in the front. and you're actually not killing them, you're not breaking the square like that, what do you think? That just shooting arquebuses, again, that happens by the mid-17th century, definitely not by the 16th, right? The 16th, pike heavily dominates. Easton says, so fundamentally the firearms are the most important offensive arm now. No, right? If here he doesn't stress any timeline because probably he understands that maybe this can be a contentious statement of if we have been talking about Renaissance warfare, definitionally pike and shot warfare is about pikes first and shot second, right? Because the pikes offense and the shot too, but it's rather the shot that has to be at a distance, defending from something else, because he's vulnerable to both the pikes and the cavalry, right? The pike brings it ahead. And it's the one probably paves the way. It allows the arquebuses to advance to begin with. So Easton says, pikes and combined arms action, their most important role is to work in conjunction with those firearms and make sure the firearms don't get taken out. They got into the other enemy pikemen. That's their first thing. There are beautiful pictures of representing the melee of pikemen. It's terrifying, all right? Arquebuses weren't given that importance. It's not a thing, again, until the mid-17th century. Easton says, so we've seen why the pike rose to popularity. A combination of features. Obviously, firearms and the growing importance of firearms played a very important role, but also it was deeper than that. It was also to do with getting soldiers onto the battlefield, but it was also connected to social changes, essentially, and economic changes that meant that you could actually train a bunch of people with pikes, and they were a useful type of soldier. It was mostly political, again, to have alongside the guns and everything else. It says, but why did the pike diminish in importance as we go, in fact, through the 16th and 17th centuries, eventually virtually disappear from the battlefield? So here I'm going, you will not wait for me, but I will be reading this because I remember the video and most of it is correct, and then I'll stop if there is something contentious, and I'll restart the recording. Or actually not, and I will explain you why, because I just read the first phrase after this and I'd say no. So first of all, premise. What Easton just said about the idea that the shot would be more important than the pike is inherently what he said at the beginning, and as much as what he normally claimed already about the longbow, or the bow in general, perhaps, arguably, he said himself, during most of the Middle Ages. Right? So the guy believes, obviously, that the shot is dominant, because if the bow was already dominant, obviously the shot is much more powerful. It's going to be going, aside from rate of fire, whatever. He does not probably realize even how sort of concretely close you had to come to the enemy. In the age of firearms, up to rifled barrels, etc., like, in order to actually disintegrate an enemy unit. All right. So you can imagine in the 16th century, especially when most troops were still pikemen, all right? And especially in the first period, here we have encounter. I made a video specifically about warfare between 1550 and 600, where 1-to-1 ratio is achieved, all right? We will make more of that, but just for saying that this channel has a pretty robust backbone to draw from. And he says in the following phrase, so there are sort of two answers to this question. The first part is more focused on why did pikes diminish in importance on the battlefield, and essentially it's down to the advancement and growing prevalence of firearms. So, yeah, ironically, one of the main reasons why pikes became so important on the battlefield was some reason in the end why they gradually started to disappear. So he triples down on the idea that the pikes essentially developed from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance because of firearms, which, again, is not true. Like, there is no actual evidence whatsoever of this, right? Pikes increase in importance because they aggress cavalry, because politically speaking, there was a capacity now to train enough people to be functional in large bodies of pikemen, which historically had not been quite possible either because countries were too small, or again, their political control was too shallow. And again, even in the past, there had been large infantry formations during the Middle Ages that are a bit underrated, right? So he literally actually believes this, that basically, in his view, pikes developed because there were guns around. No, guns were not the the traction of this. Like, pikes were the traction. Collective training was the traction. Greater political power. The insane regime was the traction, not guns. It's not about weapons. It's not about technology. Let's not stress this idea. They are dangerous. They are inherently dangerous. Right? So let me read again. If there is something, firstly, pikemen were incredibly vulnerable to firearms. So the pikemen themselves, okay, so here basically if I remember correctly, he goes fairly well. Like, he explains more or less, he talks about the bayonet, also the various types that came around. I will read again this to see if there is some problem, and I'll tell you. So yes, basically he makes one point in which he stated, I'm just paraphrasing now because overall it's correct, but he's perhaps, again, overrating how effective firearms, generally speaking, were, or just their collective use, by the way, because he rightly talks about the collective use of pikes, but what about the collective use of volleys, right, or arquebus? Again, those were really imperfect for a long time. The first ranks of the pikemen were normally armored. It would remain also for quite a long time, which is also mostly the same one for which the same pike is still around historically up to the mid-17th century. So he seems to say, okay, well, it's relatively easy just to shoot people at this, but on a battlefield with 16th century technology, he also talks about explosives that did exist indeed, but again, field artillery was not that important at the time, right? So even though pike blocks could be butchered down like by artillery at a close range, like it happened to the Swiss at Marignano, definitely overall, the whole battlefield economy did not really lean in utter disfavor of pikemen. Actually, again, pikemen had always been, imagine this, in this arc of the so-called quote-unquote military revolution from the late 13th century, so to say, when our firearms came around. We can't quite document it, but until basically the full development of linear warfare, because basically I also made a video about this. It's not like linear warfare was fully developed until the 7 Years' War. We say the 18th century is not from the January 1st, 1701, like the word linear tactics were read. There were still pikemen, actually in consistent numbers out there. So it's an incredibly long time. It's almost half of a millennium where the pike was dominant and in firearms actually hadn't. But gradually sort of replaced it, and just mostly in the last couple of generations. So it's something in relative terms, probably. So the question is, again, there is an enormous bias in favor of firearms. I understand that, but again, tactics, collective training, formations are something relatively different, right? Then he gives all a certain amount of information. What was this about? Well, the numbers essentially of ratios in different armies. He talks about the rotellas, the rodaleros, essentially in the Spanish formation. Those also represent what we just said, that swordsmen were still fairly useful in different circumstances, right? Let's leave aside that, for example, the Turks had, aside from the Janissaries, much less firepower in terms of firearms, and they stuck to bows, right? Or think about the Knights of Malta that seem to have had, I also made a video about that, a greater arms and armor bias in the medieval way for a long time it existed, etc. But the truth is that melee, cold steel, etc. are still incredibly useful and relevant in battle and elsewhere for a very long time, right? And so here some numbers are given. There's not necessity to comment on them, how much percentage or how much not. Different armies could also be different, and sometimes we don't really understand, again, beyond manuals, what the practice really was, right? So generally speaking, he's correct. He's talking about all these proportions, and then he starts talking about bayonets, and that sort of it's fairly smooth sailing. It also shows bayonets in the video. And so I will read the conclusion, because I skipped most of this part because it's really not relevant. Because again, I really think that he explained it right. I don't find anything particular that I'm sure that if you get a bit more into the numbers and what was actually happening. You could represent something a bit more granularly, not really heterogeneous, but really, again, something that we can't properly reconstruct merely from dispositive sources, and we should rather study battles per se to really get. Again, made lots of videos that about, for example, the importance of cavalry already at the end of the 16th century, from the mid 16th century contractor, is pretty strong. We've seen that video about the Battle of Dreux, like their French cavalry. Admittedly, this country had a bit less of infantry in general, as we explained before. They had to take the Swiss that were there, in fact, together with the Landsknecht as well as mercenaries. But cavalry was so important, so much there. Wasn't really ever erased from battlefields. It's not like it somehow comes back later. Many people say it's Gustavus Adolphus. Not really. Also, let's not even talk about Gustavus Adolphus, because basically everything that has been normally attributed to him as a military reformer, he did not do. Either it was already happening, or it spawns historically, actually, by the time of Charles XII as a range. And again, great general, to say the least, and everything, but again, too hyper-pumped by Protestant propaganda for different reasons. Study Gonzalo de Cordoba and this topic, because those are really the deal, also given that the Tercio set the standard up to the mid-17th century for the art of war. So I will just read the conclusion that I think I didn't listen to even today, because I didn't have much time. But in any case, he says, so there we go. That's obviously a whistle-stop tour summary of the rise and fall of the pike in the Renaissance era. Now, some of these points could definitely sustain further deeper dive videos. Some of these aspects I've skirted over quite quickly because I have to cover quite a lot of ground here. So yeah, he's right. I mean, it's auspicable that he will. I'm looking forward for more deep dive videos on the subject. We've looked especially at the Swiss and the Spanish, tiny bit at the French, but the experience of the pike and the preference of the pike was higher or lower in different places. An interesting point to note is that the English army under the Elizabethan period, for example, and the Henry VIII all the way through Elizabeth I, in that era, it's quite clear that pikes were not quite as popular in England in the 16th century as they were on the continent. And yes, because the English army actually, especially in the Elizabethan period, was falling behind the standards of the continent, right? In the first half of the 16th century, as we were saying before ourselves, you could go buy essentially a medieval army like Edward VIII fundamentally was, but it still worked. Like up to the mid-16th century, even the longbow was actually relevant, right, etc. And Easton makes it a matter of, we retain greater use of halberds and bills for some reason that's not entirely clear. Man, you didn't have a state, all right? You were not France. You were not even Austria. You were not Spain. England did not really develop much political concentration of power at that point. Also, you were also, as I discussed also in the video about the Victorian army, you have a pretty large moat around your island. You don't really need to focus on terrestrial warfare as much, but that really mostly was, okay, you had the Scots, you had the Irish, etc. That was mostly because the English did not have many resources to begin with, all right? And it takes the Stuarts to attempt a military reform, and they got beheaded. And it takes really Cromwell and later also the Glorious Revolution for the British Army to take off in any meaningfully sort of updated fashion compared to European standards. And I made also videos about this from the armies of Henry VIII. We talk about the Elizabethan period. We talk about the English Civil War and its infantry. Very interesting story. I would like to digress on that, but you can simply watch sort of the relevant stuff in the video. I wanted to say actually that even the amount of gunners does not equate necessarily to overall superiority. All right, you can have less heavy infantry that is still, for that reason, decisive, and more gunners, but still they're not decisive. This is what happens, for example, in England. At least in England, there is less infantry to begin with because the battles of the war were more fragmented, were more sort of ragamuffin-like. And some people say, England prefigured a bit what was happening also in the 30 Years' War. It's very different in scale. And so The reason that is not entirely clear, again, England did not have much of a terrestrial warfare development at that point, and it was actually painful to watch, like from the end of the 100 Years' War, right? We could talk at length about this. Easton says, equally it's clear that the Spanish, for example, the tercios were used, they used the sword and shield guys, which was somewhat unusual. Most people didn't do that, whereas the Landsknecht early on had used about 10% of the troops two-handed swords, and that's also quite unusual, so not everybody did in the same way, but it's very clear that from the Swiss pikemen of the late 1400s, well, about 1470, 1480 onwards, the Swiss pioneered the use of the pike, and it spread very rapidly, was adopted pretty much in all places, but not always the same degree. Oh my god, what a phrase. Yes, fortunately he didn't say the shot as well, because before he said something. And this thing about the shield, the sword, the Landsknecht with the double-handed, well, actually those were much more common than we think, right? It's a bit the idea that everything was uniform, standardized, like a pike and shot thing and nothing else. No, it was full of halberds, it was full of shields still up to especially the mid-16th century. You had double-handed swords still being relevant more or less also around the same period. So you found the Dutch that sort of still represent during the 80 Years' War, like troops equipped with shield, in part also naturally influenced by the Spanish overlords, but in general, right? There was plenty of that stuff. If you don't even go to the fringe of Europe, right? More like the East, the Balkans, whatever. It's mostly it was just already like those guns were not all that might at that point that we're normally told, right? Especially with those complicated reloading maneuvers that the burden of the musket, its early weight. Obviously, they were effective, but they were effective because they were starting to gradually get the edge, but only with a great effort, where infantry and cavalry were normally better, right? But more easily viable and effective at large. And again, also in the past, the missile element had played more or less the same role. It died out, he says, fundamentally because firepower became more and more better. I'm glad that a native English speaker says more and more better, so that I will be more forgiving towards my own poor English grammar. But also, I know it's a way of saying also in English, of course you can't say more and more better just to stress the thing, but it's a improvement, but also became more and more important. And they finally, the bayonet solved the problem. Within 10 years, pikes had pretty much disappeared in mainstream use. Well, yeah, not quite, actually, right? Again, the bayonet is important. After the granulation of powder is definitely the most important technological development of those centuries. But in general, right, just things had come to be what they were to be, right? And things changed, but much more gradually than it seemed. Again, linear tactics were not fully achieved until the 7 Years' War, and you would actually occasionally find pikeman units on the battlefield, right? More often, also in certain militia contexts, etc., sieges, etc. Like this siege is not much inside, but I mean, in different scenarios around, you would have still pikemen out there. Again, don't overestimate the power of firearms in a collective sense. Think about the reloading. Think about the vulnerability. There is a coming back of cavalry. There's lots of things going on. He knows. And Easton says, I will of course continue to be with my musket and my bayonet. I'll continue to be Mattis, and that was also funny. There was also another part that was funny, the one she said, about cannonballs bouncing to the infantry lines. They said, I'm laughing, but it's actually very bad. It's actually very serious or something like that. It was very funny. And and the rest is just like channel stuff. So that was it. So again, you see this is, again, I think that these videos, I don't know, people like them more. I get more views about this than my regular content, because people want to hope there is some kind of drama, or they want, I don't know, I'm not entirely sure that they watch this more because they're interested in the topic, right? I don't know what they want. The other thing is the following. For all that are watching me, if you're watching me right now, just be aware of the fact that all the things that I discuss here, I discuss in my other videos. I know that YouTube probably doesn't show you but this stuff, right? As I see from the numbers. Lots of views, thousands every time I cover scholagladiatoria, right? But there is actually like all I talk about on the channel, right? You don't need to watch this. Like if you're so interested in this stuff, you should be watching all my other videos on the subject. Again, I have you want to know how many pike and shot videos I made? Renaissance videos made. Well, okay, pike and shot, they're just because I have old videos that also don't talk just about the pike and shot era, but they blend like this one with the Middle Ages, but this will be about the pike and shot. All right. Renaissance warfare, I made 132 videos. This is the 133rd, right? So if you're interested in any of that, if you want to know how all this stuff worked, and it's plenty of stuff, there's plenty of stuff with pike and shot, like it's about infantry, about artillery, about cavalry, about all the various peoples of the era. Watch those damn videos, right? Because you will understand much more, you will learn much more from those than from these videos. These videos, I understand, they are entangling, disentangling some issues that people may think they are actual issues, but everything starts from actually knowing the history. It can't become a surprise that I make this video, say, oh, look, this guy's talking about this, where it comes from with that. I have 2,700 videos. You may want to notice, all right? So most of you also know my background. I don't think I need further qualifications. Telling you the truth, we're talking about this stuff online. For today, I see the video is very long. I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.